Halloween is a holiday where people dress up to show off their creative or unique style and celebrate with some spooky fun. But on this Halloween, someone dressed up for a sinister reason, because they wanted to hide within a crowd of people and carry out a gruesome crime at the most evil time of the year. Let's get into today's video. This story is about a mother of 4 who was living in Brandon, Florida, a town not too far from Tampa. Her friends called her flawless. She was very loving, busy, and social. She put her faith in God, worked hard as a single mama, and was thriving until one horrific and unimaginable tragedy happened on Halloween night in 2015. But before I get into how she died, I want to tell you how Tiffany James lived and who she was. Tiffany James was born in Tampa, Florida on August 18, 1980, to her mother, Rosalin James, and father, Turner Humphrey. But Tiffany didn't end up being raised by either one of her parents. Instead, she went to live with her maternal grandmother, Bua James, and therefore she kept her mother's last name, James, instead of her father's last name, Humphrey. Her father actually moved out to Gainesville and eventually started a new family with his new wife, which meant new half-siblings for Tiffany. However, Tiffany and her siblings wouldn't get to meet one another until much later in life. When Tiffany was a teenager, she began living with one of her aunts, Vicki Pittman, who was like a second mother to her. Her other auntie, Barbara James, was also very involved in her life. Tiffany graduated from Hillsborough High School, and that same year, her life changed in a dramatic but wonderful way. On July 26, 1998, she and her boyfriend, Derek Andrews, welcomed their very first son, Derek Jr. Tiffany was only 18, still navigating the transition from being a teenager to becoming an adult, but she stepped into the role of motherhood with grace and dedication. 4 years later, in April 2002, Tiffany and Derek welcomed their second son, Daryl, into the world. Though she was raising 2 young boys and still finding her footing in life, it was no easy task, but Tiffany's love for her children made them her first priority. Unfortunately, over time, the romantic relationship between Tiffany and Derek naturally came to an end, as young love often does. However, Tiffany managed to keep things amicable with her ex for the sake of their boys. She and Derek remained committed to co-parenting and working together to give Derek Jr. and Darren the stability and support they needed, ensuring they would always feel cherished by both of their parents, even though their paths had diverged. Tiffany was juggling a lot, but luckily she had a big family willing to help. They would watch her kids while she went to school, where she enrolled at Remington College, a trade school, and at Hillsborough Community College to become a licensed cosmetologist and esthetician. She was hoping to open her very own salon one day. Tiffany's experiences, growing up without her own mother and father around, made her strive to be present for her own children. Her struggles helped her understand the importance of parental support, and she wanted to make sure her sons always had someone to rely on. That commitment showed in how much she did for her boys. They were involved in sports, she made sure they were getting good grades, and she instilled her faith in both of them. Tiffany believed in God, and her belief system was a big part of her life, influencing how she viewed the world and treated people around her. After finishing her studies, Tiffany landed a job at a doctor's office, and things seemed to be falling into place. Her career was off to a good start, her boys were growing up healthy and happy, and life felt stable. But deep down, Tiffany yearned for more. She longed for a loving partner, someone she could rely on, build a future with, and create the kind of family she always dreamed of, one that she didn't necessarily have for herself. For Tiffany, it wasn't just about romance. It was about finding the right man who could bring stability, love, and be a father figure and role model in her boys' lives. In 2007, Daryl Williams entered her life, and everything changed. Daryl was exactly what Tiffany had been looking for, a mature, dependable man with life experience. He was already a father to older children. He knew how to care for kids and understood the responsibilities that came with being a parent. At 14 years her senior, Daryl brought a sense of calm and steadiness that Tiffany hadn't found in her previous relationships. She actually liked that he was a little bit older. It made her feel secure, like she finally met someone who would not let her down. Tiffany fell quickly for Daryl. He was attentive, supportive, and kind. He was the missing piece that she had been searching for. Their relationship moved very quickly, and Tiffany couldn't help but imagine the future they could build together. At 27, with 30 just around the corner, Tiffany dreamed of marriage and a life where she could raise her sons and maybe even expand her family. She knew that Daryl was the one, and she hoped they would make it official by getting married. Youth life had its own surprises in store for them. That same year, Tiffany received unexpected news. She was pregnant, and not just with one baby, but twins. The news left her stunned but also excited. What a blessing, 2 little girls coming into the world. Though the pregnancy was unexpected, it felt like fate was giving her a chance to build the family she always wanted. Daryl, equally surprised, couldn't believe it but stood by her side, ready to embrace the challenge together. He even proposed to Tiffany. It was an exciting time in their lives, and for Tiffany, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Tiffany gave birth to her twin girls, Diamond and Dina, in the spring of 2008. From the moment they entered the world, they became the light of her life. These little girls were not just cute, they were the kind of kids that make you stop in your tracks and say how adorable they are. With a mother like Tiffany, who had an eye for fashion and a natural sense of style, the twins always looked like they had stepped right out of a children's boutique catalog. Tiffany made sure to dress her daughters to impress, always in the cutest matching outfits. Their hair was always styled to perfection, whether it was bows, braids, headbands, buns, or playful ponytails. Tiffany made sure her little girls looked their best every single day. Her daughters were not just her pride and joy, they were Tiffany's motivation, her reason to keep pushing forward no matter what challenges life threw at her. Anyone who saw them could see how much she loved and cared about her children. Tiffany poured everything she had into raising them. Together, Diamond and Dina were Tiffany's mini-me's, little reflections of their mother's love, style, and spirit. Tiffany was beautiful. As I said, her friends called her flawless. She was always well put together. The clear skin, the beautiful hair, everything was so on point. Her outfits were perfectly coordinated, and she would pair everything with these blue contacts. She just knew how to make anything look good. She had a playful but professional side as well, and eventually she began working as a student recruiter at a school called Ultimate Medical Academy, which offered degrees in the medical industry. Her work family was like her home away from home. She bonded with the girls she worked with, who became not only friends but like sisters to her. That's just who Tiffany was. Someone who was always there to celebrate not only her own accomplishments, but also the milestones her friends and loved ones achieved. She would be there at your graduation, cheering you on, encouraging you if you were feeling down, always posting words of affirmation on her Facebook and helping to build others up. One quote she posted said, "Whoever is trying to bring you down is already below you." As Tiffany's little family was growing, she was about to add 4 more family members to the mix. I mentioned at the beginning that she had half-siblings. Eventually, when her daughters were just a couple of years old, Tiffany's father finally told his children that they had an older sister. Tiffany was then introduced to her 2 half-sisters, Tarina and Serena, and her half-brothers, Turner and Daryl. Tiffany and Daryl really connected. They kept in touch, and Daryl would look to Tiffany whenever he needed anything, whether it was just advice or someone to confide in. Tiffany was always there with sisterly encouragement. Her half-sisters were also excited, as they didn't grow up with a big sister. So this was all very new, exciting, and fun. Soon, Tiffany and her 4 kids were making trips up to Gainesville to celebrate holidays, birthdays, and events with her brothers and sisters and their families. Even though Tiffany had gained new relationships, the one with Daryl wasn't strong enough to stand the test of time. After about 5 years together, they decided to go their separate ways. By 2012, Tiffany was a single mom again, but it seemed like she was stronger than ever. She moved into an apartment of her own in the Providence Lakes apartment complex at 1807 Chapel Tree Circle in the town of Brandon. She also got a new job, working as a hairstylist at a local salon. She'd promote her services on Facebook and Instagram under the name Tiffany Hair Royale. She posted a graphic that had those check boxes, I'm sure you've seen them, with single and taken on the left side. Hers would say, busy doing hair, and it was checked off as busy doing hair because that's what Tiffany was focusing on. Her clients loved her. They looked forward to their appointments, and Tiffany loved making them look and feel their best. In fact, Tiffany was even asked to offer her time and services at the Look Good Feel Better class for women with cancer. This is a workshop led by licensed cosmetologists who do in-person workshops to help women with cancer manage the appearance-related side effects of their cancer treatments. Tiffany was so proud and honored to be a part of this cause. Tiffany had also started attending networking events, specifically one called SWAT, Successful Women Around Tampa. She would take her kids to church on Sundays at Rivers of Life Ministries, and the twins even attended Villa Madonna private Catholic school. The tuition there is not cheap. Nowadays, it's over $7,000 per year per student. I'm not sure what it was back in 2013, but Tiffany worked hard to make sure the girls were getting a quality education. They were also in cheerleading, the boys played sports, and they maintained good grades. Tiffany even posted Derek Jr.'s high school report card to her Facebook, showing off what a great student he was. She said, "My baby just keeps making his mama proud. First year in high school, and he still managed to keep his 3.0 GPA, play sports, and participate in extracurricular activities." Then he told me, "Mom, this is just the beginning. I'm shooting for a 4.0, and I replied, "The sky is the limit, baby." She thanked the Lord for blessing her with awesome kids and said that failure is not an option for her or in her house. Tiffany even got a personal trainer. She was working out on a regular basis at the gym, and when she wasn't working on her career or herself, any extra time she had, she spent with her kids, whether at home with them, taking them bowling, to the circus, the fair, or out to eat lunch or dinner, anything to make them smile. She posted a quote, along with pictures of all of her kids that said, "Successful mothers are not the ones who have never struggled. They're the ones who never give up, despite the struggles," with the caption, "My motivation and inspiration." Somehow, juggling all that she did, Tiffany still found some me time, which often just meant watching an episode of Criminal Minds and having a strawberry margarita. That sounds like fun to me. She called it priceless and hashtagged it as "This is the good life." I'm sure a lot of us can relate. Sometimes it's just the little things. Other times, she would make a whole event of it and go out with her girlfriends, looking fabulous while doing it. When the twins were at their dad's house and she and her girls had a little more free time, they would get dressed up and have a night out on the town. Of course, Tiffany was feeling that familiar feeling that her life wasn't complete without a partner to share it with, a man. She was looking for Mr. Right and was hopeful she would meet someone who matched her ambition and dedication to her family. But she wasn't interested in settling. Just like her Facebook post from February 10th, 2014 said, "It's better to be single with high standards than in a relationship settling for less." In the meantime, though, she was enjoying the single mama life, and that kept her busy enough. In March of 2014, Tiffany celebrated the twins' birthday at the Nickelodeon Hotel in Orlando. Then in March, it was Darren's 13th birthday. Her Aunt Vicky and her husband came out to celebrate with the family. Tiffany went all out for birthdays and celebrations. She got a custom Nike sneaker cake and a matching custom balloon set for her son, and they all sat at this long table on the upper balcony area of Mao's Italian restaurant. It was such a great time. Even Tiffany's grandma came, even though she wasn't feeling well, the one who raised her. She said she wouldn't miss it for the world. Tiffany posted pictures from that night saying, "God favors me and mine. Thank you to all of my family and friends that came out for Darren's 13th birthday dinner. He was extremely happy, and that's all that mattered to me. One monkey don't stop no show. The show went on with those that mattered the most." So what I'm assuming from this post is that someone either didn't come as expected or tried to ruin their evening somehow. It doesn't say who she was referring to by giving the emoji of a monkey. It could have been Darren's father, Derek, I'm not sure. But either way, Tiffany didn't let anyone spoil the evening. Tiffany and the kids had a really fun spring break after this. She spent one night on a casino cruise with all of her friends and a girls' night out. She had a dinner with the twins, and then she went jet skiing with her sons. In June, Diamond and Dina had their kindergarten graduation pictures taken, and that same month, Tiffany's father actually got together with her and the kids, so the summer was off to a great start. In July, the twins wore matching blue caps and gowns and officially completed their kindergarten year. They posed for really cute pictures with their brothers standing behind them. It's really hard to believe, with so much love and happiness, that it was all going to be destroyed. Tiffany's next summer would be her last, but there was no way anyone could have predicted that. That August, Tiffany turned 34, and by the spring of the next year, in 2015, she had her own hairstyling business at Pure Elegance Beauty Lounge, telling her Facebook friends to like her new business page. Tiffany was offering professional hairstyling as a certified hair loss specialist. She specialized in celebrity hair extensions for all hair types, elegant and classy styles, natural hair relaxers, custom hair coloring, healthy hair maintenance, eyelashes, and even makeup. This was the beginning of Tiffany's dream of owning her very own salon one day. She was one step closer, and even closer to another dream as well. That summer, 2015, she bumped into an old friend, and for clarity, we are going to be calling him Ben, because I don't want this to get even more confusing. We already have a Derek, a Daryl, a Diamond, and a Dina. So, Tiffany and Ben reconnected. He was someone she was already familiar with, so there wasn't really that weird, awkward stage where you have to kind of break the ice at the beginning of a new relationship. Ben was also a single parent. The two of them could relate to what that was like. They started off as friends, but soon things progressed, and then they were officially dating. I noticed during this time, Tiffany was posting a lot less on Facebook. There weren't many photos of her and the kids or her new man. It was mainly quotes and a lot of illustrations of a lion, because she was a Leo. She did, however, post on Instagram a few times, alluding to spending time with her boyfriend. One picture was of him and her with their heads together. He was kind of like kissing her neck, but he wasn't showing his face. I think she was still kind of taking it slow before showcasing her new boo. But on October 1st, 35-year-old Tiffany changed her cover photo on Facebook to a picture of a man and a woman's hands clasped together on top of a Bible, wearing wedding rings and matching Rolex watches. This, I was guessing, was an inspirational picture, something she could look forward to. Because we know Tiffany is a woman of God, she wants a forever type of love, rooted in faith, but she also wanted to prosper. This was a perfect example of her goals, and someone even commented that her finger was stuck on the love button. Those close to her knew that she was in a good place with Ben, and Tiffany had a lot of hope for the future. But we know that her life will be cut short, and all the dreams she had for her life would end at the hands of a monster. Gearing up for Halloween, the twins picked out their costumes for trick-or-treating. The year before, they went as Supergirl and the other as a zebra. Forgive me for not being able to tell them apart, they look identical to me. But this year, one of them went as a police officer, and the other was a fairy. They looked adorable. Since they lived in an apartment complex, and generally that's not the best place for trick-or-treating, the plan was to get together with friends and go to a nearby neighborhood to collect candy and spend some time together before heading back home. Tiffany snapped a picture of the girls and posted it to her Instagram with a caption, "Happy Halloween," before the trio got into Tiffany's car and headed out. Brandon, Florida, attracts a lot of families. It has affordable living, great public and private schools, safe neighborhoods, and the crime rate is below the national average. It's a place where residents feel safe walking on the street at night, especially on a holiday like Halloween, when hundreds of people are in the streets going door to door for treats. If you look at a bird's eye view, this is a very residential area, homes all around, close to where Tiffany lived. It was bound to be a fun night for everyone. But let's jump to around 11 p.m. later, that Halloween night. A woman living in the Providence Lakes apartment complex, a few doors down from Tiffany, was settled in on her living room couch, engrossed in a marathon of horror movies, which made what happened next even more eerie and unsettling. Out of nowhere, there was a thunderous boom that echoed through the walls of her apartment, which snapped her right out of being fixated on the screen of the TV. She realized it was someone banging on her front door. Before she could jump up and look out the peephole, the door suddenly burst wide open with a startling force and slammed against the wall. This was terrifying. It's Halloween night. It's dark. She's watching horror movies. She inched near the opening, curious to find out what was going on. When she cautiously peeked out, she couldn't believe what she was looking at. Right there, outside her front door, was a figure straight out of a horror movie. It was a person dressed head to toe in black, wearing a white hockey mask, just like Jason Voorhees, the villain in the Friday the 13th movies. But it was how he was looming over someone else who was lying on the ground that was so horrifying. It seemed more like a nightmare than real life. Before this neighbor could process what was happening, she noticed something else, what looked like a gun in the figure's hand. She was gripped with fear, so she grabbed her door and slammed it shut. As soon as she was inside, she heard the first bang ring out, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. She was frozen in place, hiding on the floor of her apartment. Then 2 other shots rang out, back to back. She could not believe that this was happening at her house, in front of her door. It was common for someone to knock on your door on Halloween night, opening it up to see a person in costume. But this was like nothing she could have ever imagined. This wasn't a Halloween prank or someone tricking her. It was real. After it had been quiet for a few minutes, the woman heard a gentle tapping on her door. She was scared, but at the same time concerned, because she could also hear what sounded like whimpering. Could it have been this wounded person on the other side? She didn't know, so she crawled over quietly and cautiously looked out her front window. And that's when she saw a familiar face. It was one of her neighbor Tiffany James's 7-year-old twin daughters, knocking on her door. She went over and slowly opened it up, and that's when she noticed that the little girl was covered in blood. The neighbor looked down and realized the person on the ground, bleeding profusely, was now Tiffany James. The neighbor quickly grabbed the little girl, pulling her inside to safety, closing and locking the door behind them. This is unbelievable. Can you imagine yourself in that moment? It's nothing you would ever expect. But then, just moments later, there was yet another knock on her front door. And again, the neighbor looked out to find Tiffany's other little 7-year-old daughter on the other side. She let her in, and then she examined both of them to make sure that they were not harmed. Both of the girls were, sadly, covered in their mother's blood, but they were thankfully unharmed. This blood was all over their costumes, in their hair. There was even blood in one of little Dina's ears. Clearly, they had been very close to their mother when she was shot. As the neighbor tried to wrap her brain around what had just happened, she eventually did, of course, call 911. She and a bunch of other residents of the apartment complex were calling in, each person with their own account of what they heard or saw. In a heavily populated community like this, with units close together, especially on a night like Halloween, a lot of people were still awake when the shooting occurred, and they had information to provide. Now we're going to come back to the witnesses, but emergency services and police were on their way. First responders arrived to find a black female lying on the ground in a pool of blood, with significant trauma that appeared to be from at least 2 gunshot wounds. The neighbor identified the victim as 35-year-old Tiffany James. She was then rushed to Tampa General Hospital, and of course, a bunch of neighbors were now outside, standing around, wanting to know what happened. Police were taping off the area with yellow crime scene tape and looking for clues. Emergency room doctors at the hospital could immediately tell that Tiffany had sustained significant wounds and trauma to her head and upper body. They knew this wasn't from a handgun, it was more like a shotgun. And unfortunately, no matter how hard they tried to save Tiffany's life, she died from her injuries that night. This was a homicide. The lead detective on the case was Moises Garcia. In his 14 years as a detective, he had never investigated a Halloween homicide. Detective Michael Blair and Corporal B assisted Garcia in canvassing the Providence apartment complex. Both Garcia and Blair were fathers. Detective Blair had actually just been out trick-or-treating with his own children when he got this call to respond to the scene. And Garcia not only had two sons close to Diamond and Dina's age, they were also twin boys. So this was a very emotional situation for the detectives. It hit really close to home. When the detectives arrived at the neighbor's apartment, they knew this was going to be a very delicate situation since they were going to be speaking with two 7-year-olds. One of these little girls couldn't even speak. She was trying, but there were no words coming out of her mouth. They were both in shock, as I'm sure you can imagine. The first thing that Detective Blair thought while witnessing this heart-wrenching situation was that he would not stop until he figured out who did this, who took this mother away from her children. By now, Tiffany's family members were actually showing up at the scene. The heartbreak was palpable. And what made this moment even more devastating was that Tiffany's twin daughters were the ones who called their family members from the neighbor's apartment to tell them what had happened to their mother. It's hard to imagine the emotional weight these young girls had to carry, being forced to convey this tragic news to their family members. When it was time for officers to bring the twins out to safety, they had to take extra precautions. They didn't want the children to see the blood that had stained the ground outside where their mother had just been killed. To shield them from the grim scene, the officer gently wrapped the girls in blankets before guiding them out. For the time being, the twins and their brothers were placed under the care of Bua James, Tiffany's grandmother, alongside their Aunt Vicky. It was a temporary arrangement meant to give them the care and comfort they needed after such a traumatic ordeal. Now, the crime scene investigators were on the scene, taking photos and collecting evidence. There, on the ground, was a Louis Vuitton-looking brown handbag with a broken beige strap, just a few feet away from where Tiffany's body was found. It was Tiffany's purse, and scattered near its opening was a pile of her belongings, including some cash, coins, a bottle of body mist, lipstick, a couple of lip gloss tubes, Apple earbuds, a small lotion bottle, weave glue, a coupon, her driver's license, a Vaseline lip gloss pot, a comb, a peppermint candy, a pair of gold hoop earrings, and glasses that Tiffany normally wore. When I saw this picture, there was obviously a struggle of some kind, given that the strap of Tiffany's purse was broken and everything had flown out, but nothing seemed to be taken from inside. So they ruled out a robbery as the motive for the shooting. This was such a brutal crime. It didn't make sense or match a simple robbery for some cash or even a handbag. They didn't take her car either, so this wasn't a carjacking. Instead, it really seemed like Tiffany had been targeted, especially after speaking with witnesses. But what the detectives did know was that she had been shot with a shotgun. They could confirm that because there were large, yellow shotgun shells on the ground nearby. Still, there just wasn't a lot of evidence at the scene, so they were relying on witnesses to paint a picture of what happened that Halloween night. One witness said she looked out of her apartment when she heard yelling. She saw the masked figure quickly coming up toward Tiffany, with her kids right by her side. She even saw the gun, then went back inside to call 911. So she only heard the gunshots and didn't see what happened, but she felt bad for the twins and was praying that they were going to be okay, that everyone was going to be okay. But Tiffany, of course, was not. Another neighbor said that he and his girlfriend were watching a movie when they heard a really loud sound, like a gunshot. He immediately got up, stopped the movie so they could listen, and that's when they heard what sounded like a child screaming. Multiple people actually reported seeing a person dressed in black, wearing a Jason mask, running up behind Tiffany and her girls. Others only heard the gunshots and looked out afterward to see Tiffany lying on the ground. Some saw the person fleeing on foot, but no one could tell the ethnicity of the shooter or whether it was a man or a woman. Witnesses estimated that the person was about 5 feet 7 inches to 6 inches tall, weighing around 200 to 220 pounds, and their build seemed to suggest a man. The community was in shock. Just a couple of hours earlier, Before all this unfolded, so many kids were outside enjoying the fun of Halloween. If this shooting had happened any earlier, those poor kids could have either witnessed it and been traumatized, or even worse, been caught in the crossfire. Some witnesses said they saw a silver-colored vehicle near where the shooting took place, but it apparently sped away right after the first gunshot went off. Detectives had no way of knowing if the person in the car had been just a witness who got scared, or if they were involved somehow. But the car wasn't seen leaving the community until after the person in the Jason mask was fleeing the scene. So detectives began to wonder if maybe this car was waiting for the shooter, perhaps as the killer's getaway car. The next step was to look for CCTV footage, but unfortunately the parking lot was not equipped with cameras, and no one managed to get a license plate for that silver car. Detectives were working on building a theory of this murder, suspecting that the killer could have planned and targeted Tiffany. They thought the shooter might have chosen Halloween night so they could blend in, wearing a costume that would disguise them in the darkness, and among others, dressed up for Halloween. It would make it easier to ambush her without tipping anyone off. Of course, it was difficult, but Tiffany's family knew they needed to give detectives as much information about her as they could. They were all in shock, heartbroken, and grieving. The detectives' first line of questioning was about Tiffany's daily routine, what she was like, and, of course, whether there were any men in her life who might have had issues with her. Tiffany's family shared that she often worked long hours at her student recruitment job at Ultimate Medical Academy or at the salon. On her late work days, her Aunt Vicky would pick up the twins from school, but as soon as Tiffany arrived home, around 7 or 8, the twins were always excited to greet her. Then they would make their way back to Tiffany's apartment. The family told detectives everything about Tiffany's character and personality, but added that she shied away from talking about her problems with relatives. She was the kind of person who liked to try to handle things on her own, her Aunt Vicky said. The family did what they could to help whenever they knew she was struggling. Sadly, Vicky also shared a heartbreaking detail. Diamond had actually fallen on top of her twin sister Ja that night to shield and protect her from the gunshots. It was an incredibly brave act, thinking that quickly in such a terrifying moment. Both little girls had witnessed the killer shoot their mother, a trauma that would forever taint Halloween night for them. Detectives were also informed about several men in Tiffany's life. The most significant and recent were her exes, Derek Andrews and Daryl Williams, and her current boyfriend, referred to as Ben. Tiffany had been involved with each of her exes, Derek and Daryl, for around 5 to 7 years, and she had 2 children with each, her 2 boys with Derek and the twin girls with Daryl. Daryl was her more recent ex. Tiffany had broken up with him a couple of years earlier after catching him cheating. But the family didn't think any of these men would have a reason to kill Tiffany, or that they would be capable of such a horrific crime. Still, detectives knew they had to rule them out. As any avid true crime follower would know, intimate partner violence is one of the leading causes of women's deaths, so detectives knew they needed to interview the men closest to Tiffany, and fast. At 4 o'clock in the morning, detectives arrived at Tiffany's most recent boyfriend Ben's house. When they pulled up, they were immediately on guard. It was very early, yet they noticed a light on and an open garage door. Outside, a man was pacing back and forth. As the officers approached, Ben looked up and told them he had been waiting for them, an odd thing to say. Then they noticed a firearm out of its case within arm's reach of Ben, who appeared distressed. The detectives wondered if he could be Tiffany's killer. Ben explained that he had been notified hours earlier about his girlfriend's murder. Her family had called him, and he swore he had nothing to do with it. Instead, he said he was terrified, afraid that he would be next, and fearful for his children's lives, which was why he was armed and waiting in his garage. Detectives asked Ben if he was willing to speak with them, and he agreed, even consenting to a taped interview right there in his garage. Ben explained that he had an alibi for the night of Tiffany's murder. He insisted all he wanted was to get his kids far away from the area as soon as possible, because he feared that whoever had targeted Tiffany could come after him, given that he was the closest person to her at the time. Detectives noted that Ben seemed genuinely upset and fearful, and his alibi checked out. He provided them with a timeline of what Tiffany was doing before the murder. Ben shared that he and Tiffany had taken their kids trick-or-treating together in his neighborhood. She drove over, and they all set out on foot, collecting candy and having a great time together. He said Tiffany and the girls had actually planned to spend the night at his place that Saturday, as it was the weekend. They were just going to run home, change out of their costumes, and come right back. But after some time passed, they never returned, and Tiffany didn't answer any of Ben's calls. He didn't find out what had happened until he received that phone call, informing him that she had been shot. The detectives asked if Tiffany had seemed on alert or worried about anything that night. Ben said no, she was happy and enjoying herself with the girls. Then they asked if she had issues with anyone. Ben revealed that Tiffany had felt like she was being stalked recently. She hadn't figured out who it might be, but he suggested the detectives look into her exes, who might have had an issue with her moving on and having a new boyfriend. Ben mentioned that Tiffany had experienced some strange incidents over the past few months and had been worried that someone might be lurking around, possibly trying to scare or harm her. For example, her car started acting up. It just wasn't driving correctly, so she brings it into the mechanic, and that's when they inform her that somebody had poured ammonia into her gas tank. Now, usually if someone wants to ruin an engine, they would actually use hydrogen peroxide. They'd put that in your fuel tank, which could even cause a fire, but ammonia could cause erosion, and according to the mechanic, her car would need to be flushed out, so she had to pay for it because it can do damage to your vehicle. Even that night, on Halloween, Ben said that at one point he noticed a black car with dark tinted windows kind of creeping slowly behind them as they walked through his neighborhood. That doesn't match the vehicle that witnesses say they saw leaving Tiffany's apartment complex, but the fact that Tiffany was worried about a stalker is a lead for these detectives. Except, Ben offers one more detail that is chilling, given what the detectives already know about Tiffany's killer. He said that there was a white Jason mask hanging from the black car's rearview mirror. That's weird. That's a big clue. So, out of the two exes left to talk to, Tiffany's boyfriend tells detectives he'd lean more towards Daryl than Derek, since he was Tiffany's most recent ex and they were not on the best terms. They butted heads when it came to the twins in regard to custody and other legal agreements. There was definitely some animosity there. The thing is, those two little girls that were there when their mother was shot were Daryl's daughters, and detectives really don't think a father would put them in such a dangerous and gruesome situation. He wouldn't want them to witness something like that. But they still need to speak to him. The next day, on Sunday, November 1st, detectives head out to the last known address of 49-year-old Daryl Eugene Williams, hoping to meet with him and get additional information about Tiffany and his alibi to rule him out. They pull up to 20002 Thornbush Place in Brandon, Florida, which is only about a 5-minute drive from Tiffany's apartment. When they get to the house, there are a couple of vehicles in the driveway: a dark-colored SUV, a green sedan, and a gold Toyota Camry. And again, they don't match the car the witnesses said they saw from the scene. But maybe that silver car wasn't involved at all. Just to do their due diligence, the detectives split up into teams, and a couple of them go around the neighborhood asking neighbors what cars are usually parked over at Daryl's. No one mentions a silver vehicle. When the other detectives knock on Daryl's front door, nobody answers, so they decide to wait outside in their cruisers until Daryl makes his way home. But before he does, one of his older daughters walks up the driveway. Before she makes it inside, the detectives stop her and tell her why they're there. She had no idea that Tiffany had been murdered, so when they give her this news, she nearly drops to her knees. She is so upset, especially when she finds out that her little half-sisters, Diamond and Anya, were present when their mother was gunned down. She wanted to know if they were okay, and the detectives let her know that they were unharmed. But what they really needed was to speak to her father, since he's someone close to Tiffany. Now, after hearing everything, Daryl's daughter's perception about why the detectives were there was because they thought that maybe her dad was involved. She wanted to help in any way that she could, so she told them what she'd experienced in the past, saying that her father was the type of guy who had to get his way. He was very controlling. She'd seen him become violent, especially towards his romantic partners, and this usually happened when they weren't doing as he expected them to. If you go against him, she said, there would be consequences. She'd even witnessed him pull a gun on her own mother back when they were married, before he got together with Tiffany. According to his daughter, Daryl pointed the gun right in her mother's face during an argument. She went on to say that after the relationship between her dad and Tiffany ended, he was not happy. They'd been in and out of court ever since. Before the detectives left, Daryl's daughter let them know that she hadn't spoken or seen her father since earlier in the day on Halloween. The detectives decide to take a trip over to Daryl's workplace at Mosaic Phosphate Plant in Riverview. This was about 15 minutes away in East Tampa. They asked his employer about his work record, what type of employee he is, whether he's got anything of concern on his work record, and of course, they explain the reason why they're asking. His boss tells investigators that Daryl is a very hard worker. He's the type of guy who would work a day shift and a night shift, and even pick up shifts when other people would call in. He'd actually be the first person to offer to cover a shift for someone. He did work the day shift on Halloween, but when someone called in to take the night off at the last minute, Daryl declined to pick up that shift, saying that he would not be available. Now that's not that out of the ordinary. It is Halloween, it's a holiday, and he has kids, but it could mean that he had the opportunity to commit this crime. When detectives informed Daryl's boss that his ex-wife had been murdered and they needed to obtain Daryl's alibi, his response was kind of like, "Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if he had something to do with it." So of course this is going to raise a red flag, and they asked him to elaborate. Well, according to his boss, Daryl had been known to be explosive at times. That's their words. He was the type that wasn't afraid to get in your face. He wasn't the most professional employee. He was even known to threaten coworkers when they challenged him on something. He was abrasive, and people tried to actually steer clear of him so they wouldn't set him off. Even the management felt that they were walking on eggshells around Daryl, and they would avoid him at all costs if they could, especially the women in the office. All of his female supervisors expressed the opinion that Daryl looked down on them. He didn't respect them, and he acted as though he was better than them, like he didn't need to listen to what they said. It wasn't uncommon for him to attempt to control the people in higher positions, especially if they were women. However, that didn't stop women from getting into relationships with him, because he did have good qualities, as we've heard. Detectives were also informed he had a current girlfriend, so this added a new element to their theory. If Daryl had moved on from Tiffany and been in a couple of years of a happy new relationship, it wouldn't really make sense to them that he would be jealous enough that she was dating a new man to commit a crime like this. But then they were thinking maybe he didn't want anyone getting close to his twin girls. They realized that time is of the essence. I mean, it always is in these cases. So they put out an APB for Daryl's gold Camry. Eventually, later that day, it's spotted in an area of East Tampa, not far from his workplace, in a location called Claremel. It's a residential area, only a few miles away from where Tiffany lived. They run the address of 1717 Windeer Way, and it comes up to a house that's owned by a 38-year-old woman named Rosalin, Washington. Detectives make their way over to this house, and outside in the driveway are two vehicles, a gold Camry and a silver sedan. And this was the first time that a vehicle had matched the description of the one seen fleeing the scene. This was a silver Nissan Altima. So they knock on the front door. A woman answers, and she identifies herself as Rosalin Washington, the owner of the home. When they ask why Daryl's car is parked in her driveway, that's when she explains that she's his girlfriend. At this point, the detectives are upfront with her. They let her know that they were there to ask Daryl some questions in regard to his ex-fiancée Tiffany James's murder. Rosalin tells the detectives that she doesn't know Daryl all that well because they'd only recently begun dating, and he wasn't at her house at the moment. However, she said she was aware that he had an ex, and that he shared 2 7-year-old twin girls with a woman named Tiffany. She also knew that she had been murdered. Rosalin explains that they had been informed early that morning and that Daryl left to go speak with his attorney. Now, it may look suspicious, but then again, both Daryl and Tiffany had legal counsel. We know that because they had some legal matters, according to Daryl's daughter. And now that there's a murder investigation, I think that most people would want legal advice, knowing that the detectives were bound to look into Tiffany's exes. But the detectives also see this as a red flag. They realize it's not a solid indication that someone's guilty. Someone familiar with their rights in the law, like Daryl appeared to be, would know to speak to a lawyer if a murder occurred involving someone close to them. But they hadn't even determined if he was a suspect yet, and they never notified him that he was. Nevertheless, it was obvious that people close to Tiffany were going to be at the top of their list. They tell Rosalin to call them if she has any additional information, and then they leave. But then, about only 20 minutes later, the detectives get a phone call from a criminal defense attorney named Norman Cannella. Now, he introduces himself as Daryl's lawyer and informs the detectives that as soon as he was notified that Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office had come looking for Daryl, he wanted to make them aware that he was in contact with Daryl Williams, and if they wanted to speak to him, they needed to go through him, his lawyer. They were not permitted to speak to Mr. Williams under any circumstances without him present. It's clear that Rosalin probably informed Daryl that the detectives came knocking. At this point, the media went to speak with Tiffany's family members that night, including Bua James, her grandmother. She said she just didn't understand how this could happen, but she was trusting in God to fix it. Tiffany James' grandmother, Miss Bula James, doesn't want her face shown, but she cannot conceal the sadness over the murder of her granddaughter, a granddaughter she raised. They also spoke to Tiffany's Aunt Vicky, and they just wanted the killer to be found and arrested. Her aunt says, "It's all been too tough to bear. She was murdered in front of her 2 girls, 7-year-old kids. So it's devastating. We have no closure. No one is giving us any closure." Then the very next day, Rosalin ends up calling the detectives. This is November 2nd, and she wants to provide additional information about Daryl. Rosalin actually painted a completely different picture of Daryl than one investigators had already heard. Granted, she did admit she hadn't known him very long, but according to her, Daryl was kind, loving, and a good father. He wasn't controlling or possessive, and most importantly, she insisted that Daryl had no issues with Tiffany James whatsoever. On top of that, Rosalin was adamant that Daryl couldn't have been involved in Tiffany's murder because he had been with her that entire night. When detectives asked her for a timeline of Halloween night, Rosalin walked them through the evening in detail. She explained that Daryl went to work that morning, then came to her house afterward, around 7 p.m. They spent the evening sitting outside handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. The two enjoyed each other's company, having a couple of beers, laughing, and relaxing. She described the scene in detail. She even shared how she was sitting on Daryl's lap and they were enjoying the night together. But eventually, Daryl got tired, so they decided to call it a night. They packed up the candy, went inside, and Daryl fell asleep on the couch in the living room. Rosalin was not quite ready for bed, so she ran out to a nearby store to grab some food and take care of a couple of quick errands. She said she was gone for maybe an hour and a half, and returned somewhere around 9:30 p.m. or 10 p.m. at the latest. When she got back, Daryl was right where she had left him, asleep on the couch. She stayed home for the rest of the night, eventually falling asleep too, and then waking up around 1 o'clock in the morning with Daryl still asleep right on the couch. Rosalin's account was firm. Neither of them had left the house or gone anywhere near Tiffany's apartment that night. It was true she did drive a silver car, but so did a lot of other people. It's a popular color. Actually, gray and silver are the third and fourth most popular car colors, with white and black coming in first and second. So, With this new information, the detectives were somewhat at a dead end until they could get some more concrete evidence. It's only been 2 days since Tiffany's murder, so you might think this next part is a little insensitive, but without any viable leads, they're desperate, and they asked Tiffany's family if they would be permitted to interview the twins. I can't even imagine how difficult that would have been for them. Their Aunt Vicky explained that since their mom was shot and killed, both of the girls dreaded nights. They were clinging to her side when stepping out of a car because that's what they had done right before Tiffany was gunned down. They were stepping out to walk to their front door. How sad is that? Something that little girls should be free to do without feeling scared. Now Vicky says they don't want to be left alone and they're haunted by what they witnessed. Rightfully so. The lead detective, Moises Garcia, empathized with Vicky. He explained that he had twin sons and that this case had struck a personal chord with him. He even began tearing up when he was speaking with her about this crime. He was going to do anything he could to bring Tiffany's killer to justice, but they needed the twins' help. The family agreed, and a forensic investigator was brought in to interview the girls that day. They wanted to hurry because they wanted everything to be fresh in their minds. The twins were brought to the Children's Advocacy Center at the Hillsborough Police Department. Now this is a special building equipped with rooms designed to look like a kid's bedroom, not a police interview room. And that is done on purpose. There are toys for kids to play with, activities for them to do, coloring books, things like that. And that's when they try to make them feel comfortable just being kids, while at the same time asking them questions in an appropriate manner. They did separate the girls so that they would not influence one another's perspective and only give them information on what they specifically remembered. When Dina was interviewed, she was doing a great job engaging with the investigator. They started off talking about fun kid stuff to build rapport and also get her settled in before talking about the night of the murder. But as soon as they went there, this poor little girl just completely shut down. She was crying and told them she wanted to leave. I cannot blame her for feeling that way. This is such a tragic experience, and then just so soon afterward. Now it was Diamond's turn. They say the twins can look alike but have very different personalities, and I think that can be true. Diamond was much more outgoing and talkative, definitely about the generic questions that they had. Then, she even ended up being very detailed about Halloween night and what happened to her mother. The investigators were so impressed by how articulate she was. It was almost like she had a photographic memory. She spoke in detail about what she remembered seeing that night. When they asked her if she thought she knew the person who had hurt her mommy, she said she couldn't be sure since she didn't see his face. But she admitted that her dad argued with her mom a lot. But the next fact that Diamond provided was both important and chilling. She told the investigator that her dad had pictures of the inside of their apartment, Tiffany's apartment, a place that he had never lived before. But not only that, her dad also had pictures of mommy's new boyfriend Ben's house. Wow, why would he have those? I was thinking, how did this little girl know to provide that information? But I'm sure they were asking all the right questions. This was huge. Now that Diamond had relayed this information to them, they wanted to see if little Dina would corroborate it. And sure enough, she said she also saw the photos that her daddy had. She said that her daddy had said he got them from a private investigator. But why would Daryl need a private investigator to look into Tiffany? The detectives began pulling up their court records, and wow, was this a heated custody battle. It was very contentious, but also something that's very common. Both Tiffany and Daryl wanted legal custody of the twins, and they were willing to continue to bring legal motions against one another until they got it. But there was more. The legal reports documented a long, volatile relationship over 7 years, and when they were together, they were both accusing one another of all kinds of abuse. Both of them had requested protective orders against one another at least twice, and at both times they were denied. Neither one of them was granted protection. In one of Tiffany's requests from back in 2011, when the two of them started to separate but were still sharing visitation with the girls, Tiffany wrote, I'm afraid to meet him alone because of all the threats he has made. She was asking the court for supervision while exchanging the twins, but this was ultimately denied. In one of Tiffany's requests from back in 2011, when the two of them started to separate but were still sharing visitation with the girls, Tiffany wrote, "I'm afraid to meet him alone because of all the threats he has made." She was asking the court for supervision while exchanging the twins, but this was ultimately denied. In another petition, Tiffany told the court that Daryl disrespected her older sons, saying that if they died, he would spit on their graves. Tiffany said, "He threatened our life, saying that he will do something to me and my boys, and my family would have to prepare for a funeral." The accusations went back and forth for years, both claiming that the other one was the problem. In August of that year, just a couple of months before Tiffany was killed, it was Daryl who filed a petition of his own. He alleged that Tiffany's family, her relatives, were harassing him with phone calls and threatening to blow his brains out. His words. A judge dismissed this petition because there was insufficient evidence to prove that this really happened, so they couldn't proceed with any legal remedies. It seemed as though it was just a he said, she said situation. But it was clear that they definitely disliked one another and were still at odds in the weeks leading up to the killing. This, coupled with the fact that Ben told investigators he saw a black car creeping close behind them on Halloween night, with a white Jason mask hanging from the car's rearview mirror, made Daryl their prime suspect, unless new information was provided to them to rule him out. Maybe he got the private investigator because he wanted to gather more evidence to use against Tiffany in court. The detectives began interviewing more of Tiffany's friends and family members, and they believed that Daryl would be capable of harming Tiffany. He had actually come up to her work recently and harassed her, threatening her and making her feel unsafe. As a matter of fact, the day before the murder had taken place, like in many cases we've heard about, there was a custody decision being made. This is a huge red flag, a prime time for dangerous situations to occur. The court was going to make a final decision in the case on who was going to get custody, and all the evidence provided to the court sided with Tiffany. She was granted full legal custody of Diamond and Anayat, and obviously Daryl was not happy. These cases are always complicated. It's hard to choose between two parents, but in this case, Daryl wanted the twins because it seemed like he didn't want to pay Tiffany a dime in child support. He had already been complaining about this aspect of the case for a while, and since the twins were only 7, he was looking at being on the hook every month for at least the next 10 to 11 years. The thing is, the twins were not his only children. Daryl had children from previous relationships, and he already owed child support for those kids. So the detectives kept on digging, and they uncovered that Daryl owed, just wait for $100,000 in back child support already for the kids that he had with different women, not Tiffany. $100,000. Just let that sink in. He couldn't get ahead, and there was about to be even more money he owed, not just for one baby, but the 2 babies he had, Diamond and Anya. Could this have been a motive for murder? Well, we've seen cases in the past where it has been. You already know money is a huge reason why someone would be willing to kill someone. If Tiffany's out of the picture, he doesn't have to pay child support. Detective Blair was actually hoping that this was not the case, because these 2 poor little girls had been through so much already. If it was their own father that committed this crime, they would have to testify against him in court. Re-traumatization, though, they needed concrete evidence. So, on November 6th, they decided to get a search warrant and subpoena Daryl's new girlfriend, Rosalin's phone records, so they could pinpoint where she was on the night of Halloween. Now, it does take a few days to obtain those records, so in the meanwhile, they continued to provide comfort and information to Tiffany's family. They were a wreck. Tiffany's grandmother wasn't even sleeping. She would stay up all night long, praying for hours and hours that they would find Tiffany's killer. And with Thanksgiving and then Christmas coming up, they were dreading the holidays without the twins having their mother around. I mean, she had 4 kids. Let's not forget she has the 2 older boys as well. Tiffany's funeral, or going home celebration as it was called, was going to be held on Saturday, November 14th, at 11 a.m. at the New Mount Zion Church, followed by her burial service at Orange Hill Cemetery. Meanwhile, detectives are sifting through Daryl's girlfriend Rosalin's phone records, and her GPS does not put her at home at the time Tiffany was killed, so they already know that she's being deceptive. But it's where her phone was that pointed to a smoking gun. It was at Tiffany's apartment complex. Wow. So now they wondered, had Rosalin committed this crime? Had Daryl actually been sleeping, and she left to take matters into her own hands? But then again, her body type did not match the stature of the person the witnesses saw running away from the scene. But remember, she does drive a silver car, and it's said that it left as soon as the person who shot Tiffany was running away. So, had Daryl used Rosalin's car that night without her knowledge, or was she his getaway driver and involved in this entire thing? By November 21st, the detectives go and pick up Rosalin, and they detain her on suspicion of being involved in a murder. They bring her down to the police station and put her in an interview room, which is not as cozy and comfy as her last interview in the comfort of her own home. They were hoping that by putting pressure on her, she would tell them what she knows. Garcia first tried to build rapport with Rosalin. He tells her there are 2 little girls suffering, 2 innocent girls who lost their mother, and they're hoping that Rosalin can shed some light on what happened. They don't confront her with her GPS info right out the gate, but Garcia begs her, "Do not lie to me." She tells him she's being honest, but she knows nothing about Tiffany's murder. So they had to turn up the heat. Garcia takes out a map, he puts it in front of her, and it has all these dots of the places where her phone had pinged on Halloween. Detective Blair is also present in this interview room, and as Rosalin's reviewing this map, she knows, like, damn, they got a lot of information on me. He and Garcia are letting her know that they know she's not telling the truth, and Blair asks her point blank, "What happened on Halloween? Please tell us, because there are 2 little girls that witnessed this." Rosalin did start to break down. She was hysterically crying so hard she fell out of her chair, then rolled on the floor, curling up in the fetal position in the corner of that room. But it seemed like her reaction was related to what Detective Blair said about those poor little girls, and not because she was going to confess to knowing anything. But Garcia is pushing her, saying, "Tell us what you know, let us help you." But Rosalin is incoherent. She's just sobbing and wailing. She's heard saying, "Oh God, why?" like over and over again, but she still hasn't said anything incriminating about herself or Daryl. So Garcia blows up on her. He's at his wit's end. He knows that she's lying to them. She knows more than she's telling them. She was there when Tiffany was shot. Her phone puts her there. So he's like, either give up the information or get the E out of my office. Rosalin doesn't open up. Instead, she tells them that she's going to leave and she's not under arrest. So, they have to let her go. But they do inform her that they have obtained a search warrant for her vehicle, so she will not be taking her dark silver Nissan Altima home with her. They took it into an evidence bay and started to look inside. They were hoping that they would find something to link the car to the murder, like the mask, some kind of clothing, black sweatshirt or pants or something. The exterior of the car was perfectly clean. The interior was also fairly clean. It did look used. I mean, there was normal dirt and debris on the floor mats. But overall, there was just nothing. There was no visible blood or anything inside this car, except for a pair of work boots with some white substance on them on the floor of the passenger side of the car. In the back seat was more of that white substance on the carpet, as well as a construction hard hat, a pair of safety goggles, and some safety harness material, which looked like it belonged to Daryl for his work at the chemical plant. But there was just nothing that stood out to investigators. On November 24th, which was only 2 days before Thanksgiving, the investigators were notified that Rosalin, along with her attorney, she had retained counsel, wanted to meet with them at the police station. She was ready to tell them what really happened on Halloween. She admits that she drove Daryl over to Tiffany's apartment upon his request. She said what she told them about them sitting in front of the house handing out candy. That was all true. But then, according to her, out of nowhere, Daryl asked her if she would mind taking him to go do something real fast, not explaining what it was, and she agreed. She said then he instructed her on where to drive, and she told investigators that she had no idea what Daryl was asking her to do. She had no idea what his intentions were. But I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, but we're gonna get to that in a moment. She said she got to an apartment complex, and Daryl explained he was going to be waiting for Tiffany to arrive. Rosalin was playing a game on her phone, thinking that maybe they were there to exchange the kids or for him to see their costumes, something like that. But then, when Tiffany's car pulled up, she said that Daryl got out of the passenger seat of the car, put on a white hockey mask, and pulled a gun from his waistband. Rosalin claimed that, at that point, she panicked and drove off, leaving Daryl behind. She said she wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she said she didn't see anything, and she didn't hear any gunshots. She just drove home. But apparently, she said when she arrived, Daryl was already there. She claimed she had no idea how he got back to her house. But first of all, we already know that Tiffany was not shot with a handgun, she was killed with a shotgun. Let's not forget that fact. So you're telling me, I'm speaking to her, you're telling me, Rosalin, that he was somehow able to conceal a shotgun? You didn't see it? How? Especially if he needed easy access to it from the passenger seat of her car. I called bullshit. Also, multiple witnesses told investigators they saw the silver car leave after at least the first gunshot went off. And thirdly, Rosalin's house was at least 16 minutes away from Tiffany's. If she left in her car and Daryl was on foot without a vehicle, how did he make it to her place before she got home? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like the story makes any sense. Detectives also know that things are not adding up, but this is all they had. They thought Daryl was guilty, and if Rosalin was willing to testify about what she just told them, it could mean that Tiffany's killer was brought to justice. So they decided to do what they do in these cases, offer her limited immunity, knowing that she was probably afraid to tell them more because she didn't want to be implicated in this crime. But that makes me so angry because I'm like, wait a minute. If she drove him there, she would have to be involved. There's no way he could have concealed that gun. They needed an arrest warrant for Daryl, and if Rosalin agreed to provide these details without implicating herself, then it would be enough for them to detain Daryl and charge him with first-degree murder. The detectives spoke with the state's attorney's office that afternoon, and they agreed with the deal. So now, they had what they needed to make an arrest. But if Daryl did this, he was a very violent and dangerous man, so the officers had to proceed with caution. They found out he was at work that evening, so they decided it would be a safe place to confront him there. The reason why is because this chemical plant had a high level of security. It was right near a port. When he goes in, he has to go through a security checkpoint, so there's no way for him to bring a gun inside. The detectives informed Daryl's boss that they had intentions of arresting him at this facility, and further, they wanted to be undercover when they did so. So the boss provided them with jumpers and hard hats to let them blend in with other employees. They got to this area where Daryl was. He was filling out his paperwork and whatnot, and they did a sneak attack on him. They held him at gunpoint and told him he was under arrest. Of course, this man was taken by surprise, to say the least, but he was cooperative. He didn't say a word. He just turned around, let them handcuff him, and then, of course, he said he wanted to speak to his attorney, but he would have plenty of time to do that later. That night, Tiffany's family members were notified about Daryl's arrest, as well as all the information that Rosalin had provided up to that point. The news came as a relief. Vicky told investigators that it was like a burden was lifted off their hearts. They were glad that Daryl would not be walking the streets or able to be free to harm anyone else. Who knows what he was capable of, she added. He would be spending Thanksgiving where he belonged, behind bars. I actually do have a clip from ABC Action News, so I'm going to play it for you. And the man who is behind bars tonight is the same person that detectives questioned initially after this happened nearly a month ago. Tiffany James was almost home after celebrating Halloween when she was shot twice. Her twin daughters, who are 7, saw the brutal murder. Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputies say their father, Daryl Williams, pulled the trigger twice before running away. Tonight, he is charged with first-degree murder with a firearm. As you can imagine, this has been difficult on Tiffany's family, but they told me they received an overwhelming amount of support from the sheriff's office. They say they are thankful for Detective Garcia, Detective Blair, and Corporal Bailey, who kept them in the loop about the case the whole time. When he told us, everybody probably in the neighborhood heard us jumping up and just crying. We get honor to God because my mama prays every night. Every night I'm hearing my mom up all night. When my mom is not sleeping, now that justice is done and he's off the street, we can sleep. That is sad and it's bittersweet, as Vicky said. Now they can at least sleep. Her poor mother, the one who helped raise Tiffany, she wasn't sleeping because, as I mentioned earlier, she was praying and praying that the killer would be caught. I don't know if they expected it to be Daryl, but when the media caught up with some of the people who knew and loved Tiffany, including her friend Danielle Bailey and co-worker Ian Harvey, here's what they had to say about her. Tiffany James had an unforgettable smile, and people saw it every day at work. She was an online admissions representative at a school. Her co-workers were her work family. You are with the people you work with more than you are with your own family, and that was the case a lot with us. She was very quiet, but when you got to know her, she was one of our own. She was a very loving person, and she cared about her kids so much. But we're definitely doing what we can to help everybody. So when they heard Tiffany had been shot twice Halloween night, it hurt them badly. More than a month after she was murdered, deputies arrested Daryl Williams. Tiffany's family says Williams killed the mother in front of their twin daughters. Nearly 2 weeks ago, friends and family honored her using her favorite color, the symbol of awareness. I know we all pray that, we don't have any friends or family who may be going through similar situations, and I just hope that if anybody is, they're able to talk to someone, they said. More than anything, her friends want to help Tiffany's family and her 4 children. I think that's actually a great message from Mayana, that if you or someone you know is going through a domestic situation, try to talk to someone. I know it's easier said than done, and Tiffany did seek help, at least from the court, but she was denied, like so many other women and men. Daryl was being held at this point without bail on a charge of first-degree murder. In the meantime, detectives decided to bring Rosalin back into the station, hoping that now, since she got immunity for her part in the crime, she would be willing to tell them everything that happened that night and why. First, she explained that she hadn't told them the whole story because she was scared for her own life after witnessing what Daryl had done. But she was also heartbroken and hurt about everything. She, like so many women before her, really thought Daryl was a good person, someone that she was going to spend her future with. He had a way of making women believe that that was true at first. Anyway, eventually, Rosalin admitted that she took Daryl over to Tiffany's, and she was also still in the parking lot when he fired the first shot. She said she heard them arguing, and then Tiffany screamed before Daryl pulled the trigger. But the fact that she had lied and already changed her story wasn't going to look good in a courtroom. They were relying on her as their star witness, but as they were building their case, they were nervous about putting her on the stand because of her credibility, or lack thereof. Then there was new information that came out from Daryl himself following his arrest. Daryl obtained a public defender, Dana Hentz, and they let the lead prosecutor on this case, Scott Herron, know that they were planning on painting Rosalin as a liar, a cheater, and a schemer. They had every right to present other theories to a jury, and they intended to, because according to Daryl, there was way more to the story. It wasn't him that killed Tiffany. He claimed no, it was actually his adult son, Darren Williams, and his mistress, Rosalin Washington. Wait a minute, yeah, you're hearing that correctly. According to Daryl, his son, his adult son, and his girlfriend were framing him for the murder. I know Daryl said that he found out his own son was having an affair with his girlfriend, and the two of them came up with a scheme to continue this secret affair and ultimately get all of Daryl's money after the murder. They were going to pin it on him and then liquidate all of his assets. The defense was planning to shift the blame to Daryl's son, Darren, while Prosecutor Heron didn't believe that any of this was true, and he was fighting to stop the defense from bringing this up unless they could, in good faith, show that Darren had anything to do with the murder. Otherwise, they should be prohibited from questioning anyone about this aspect of the case or getting into this alternative theory whatsoever. Daryl's defense attorney argued, though, that any possible motive, whether it was money, whether it was to be in a relationship with his son, it's all motive, and that they would fight to argue that in court. Well, the detectives, along with the prosecutor's office, feared that this was going to turn into a circus, with these two poor little girls having to witness all of it. They didn't have the physical evidence to link Daryl to the crime, and if the defense ruined Rosalin's credibility, let's say there's evidence that she slept with his son, then their witness would be no good. So they decided to offer Daryl a plea deal. This was tough, because Tiffany's family wanted to see Daryl spend the rest of his life behind bars. Her Aunt Vicky said, "I hope he gets life. He broke up a family. 2 girls lost both their parents. 2 boys don't have their mother." But in order to keep Daryl off the streets at all, they offered him 20 years in prison instead of life if he would plead guilty to Tiffany's murder. This was a man that shot his children's mother in the face with a shotgun in cold blood while she was lying defenseless on the ground. For those who loved Tiffany, this did not seem like justice. He would be out when he was 69 years old, still young enough to experience happiness, a future, a life of his own. He callously robbed that from Tiffany. But the deal went through. One of the hardest parts is not knowing why he did this. He wasn't required to explain his motive at all. So what do you think? Because one of his cellmates claimed that Daryl confessed to him that he did it because Tiffany refused to take him back after they broke up. And it was a classic case of, if he couldn't have her, then no one could. But I don't know. I'm not sure it's just that. Then there's the money aspect of it all. And that seems like more of a reason to get rid of Tiffany, with all the money he owed already, and then having her winning in court the day before he killed her. That seems directly connected to her murder. But it could be a little of both. With this plea agreement, Daryl didn't have to answer to why he did what he did. I also have to say I'm not a huge fan or believer in jailhouse confessions coming from cellmates, but it is what it is. Whatever the reason, it seems clear that Daryl did not have any concern for his own daughters. He used a high-powered weapon that could have easily killed either one of them or both. Even just the shell casing could have caused them harm. Side note, Rosalin was not charged for her role in this crime, and when Daryl, who was Tiffany's half-brother, found out about the sentence only being 20 years, it did not seem like justice at all. Daryl is actually scheduled for release from Jefferson Correctional Institution in 2035. That seems so soon. In the aftermath of Tiffany's murder, her family tried hard to move on, but that holiday was very hard for them. It was the first Thanksgiving and Christmas that Tiffany's 4 children were without their mother. Even Daryl was affected in a way that interfered with him ever being able to enjoy Halloween again. Every year, he takes a leave of absence from work for at least a couple of days before and after Halloween, because he knows it's going to affect him emotionally, and he doesn't want to have a breakdown at work. So you can just imagine how Tiffany's children must have dealt with her murder, especially the twins, knowing that their own father had done that. Imagine you're enjoying a girls' night out in your hometown with your best friends, drinking, dancing, hanging out, cutting loose, with not a care in the world. And you deserve it. You've been working hard all week. But what no one deserves is a normal night out that ends with their very last breaths. Today's case is about a beautiful woman named Lindsay Marie Nichols. Lindsay Marie Nichols was born in Des Allemands, Louisiana on April 2, 1984, to her mother, Jolene Richard. From everything I could gather online, Jolene was a single mom, if not from the start, for most of the time raising Lindsay. Jolene did end up getting married to a man named Adi Dufresne, and Lindsay had a sister, Kayla, from that marriage. Jolene always wanted a daughter, and her wish came true when Lindsay came into this world. She was Jolene's everything. Lindsay was a beautiful little girl, and she grew up to be a very gorgeous woman. She was born and raised in Des Allemands, Louisiana. It's in the southeastern part of Louisiana. It's a very small town, that's for sure, with only about 2,000 people living there, up to the present day. This area is surrounded by bayous, which are slow-moving creeks or swampy sections of river or lake where the water is still. Sometimes the bayou is seen as eerie or dangerous. There could be unknown creatures lurking under those still surfaces. It's the home of snakes and alligators just waiting to pounce. But this is also Lindsay's home. It's the catfish capital of the universe. Popular things to do there are to take airboat rides, have crawfish boils, drink on boats, and other outdoor activities like hiking, biking, and fishing. In this area of Louisiana, the locals identify as Cajun. Since there's not too much to do in this tiny town, you become good friends with the people you live near. Growing up, Lindsay had a very close-knit group of girlfriends, with one of her best friends being Jessica Barrios, who grew up with Lindsay. As Lindsay got older, she also found herself in a position like her mother, a single mom to the sweetest, most precious little son named Peter Paul Rose. He looks almost identical to Lindsay. Those big blue eyes, they're out of this world beautiful, just like Lindsay was Jolene's world. Peter was Lindsay's world. She wanted to do the best she could, as far as her career and a stable life were concerned, to provide Peter with the best life possible. Lindsay's childhood friend Jessica had a daughter close to Peter's age, so the two of them spent time together with their kids, who also became very close. But the girls also liked to have some fun, and it wasn't hard to find it either. New Orleans is only 45 minutes northeast of Des Allemands, but being there, you could feel like you're transported to another world. New Orleans, Louisiana, is a one-of-a-kind destination. I'm sure you've at least heard of Mardi Gras, and if so, you probably think it's just lots of drinking, partying, necklace-wearing people with outrageous outfits walking down the streets. But the tradition is actually religious in nature. It comes from the French Catholic celebrations of carnival feasts and an expedition for the French to take claim over the Louisiana territory. Over the years, it evolved into what is now known as Fat Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday. Sometimes the celebration lasts much longer, from 1 to 3 months, and that's when the streets come alive with art, music, and costumes. There are different parts of New Orleans, though, and Mardi Gras is traditionally celebrated in the French Quarter. However, about 20 minutes away, you'll find New Orleans East, and those two areas are like night and day. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, this area, like many others, was practically destroyed. Just look at Six Flags amusement park. They had to permanently close after the entire park flooded. By 2015, almost a decade later, the Little Woods neighborhood in eastern New Orleans was ranked among the most dangerous neighborhoods. Parts of eastern New Orleans are really rough, but for those who grew up there, they don't know anything different. So, Lindsay wasn't afraid. She was popular among the locals and considered the people there her people. This is where she found herself on the night of June 20th, 2015. But we have to backtrack for you to understand what brought Lindsay out that night. As I mentioned, Lindsay was popular. Because of how pretty she was, she got into modeling. She did a lot of it, and it was clear that she really enjoyed getting dolled up, having her pictures taken, her hair, the makeup, everything. And it was obvious that men liked looking at her too. Generally speaking, Lindsay was sexy, so those were the types of pictures taken of her, either in lingerie or a sexy dress. I mean, she looked good in anything, even when the pictures weren't professional. You could tell from the comments, Lindsay knew she caught the attention of men easily, though this sometimes meant unwanted attention too. But Lindsay was sweet, kind-hearted, and made friends easily. She wasn't the type to give anyone any issues, and that's why she was popular. She made people feel important, and she was fun. Lindsay liked to go out. She liked to have drinks, loved Outback Steakhouse, to dance, spend time with friends, and of course, in order to play hard, you usually have to work hard. By the summer of 2014, Lindsay was looking for a job. She wanted something serious and ended up finding one, although it took her out of Louisiana and into Texas. By October 2014, Lindsay was saying goodbye to her Louisiana friends on Facebook and moving. Lindsay worked as a timekeeper at Texas construction sites, constantly moving to different work sites all day, every day. She was a hard worker, very serious about her position, but anytime she had off from work, she wanted to go back home and be with her core group of friends. That was Jessica Ann, Lauren, and Jessica Barrios. Since Lindsay was outgoing, funny, and fun to be around, she had lots of friends and even more acquaintances. But her close girlfriends were the ones she couldn't wait to get back to. She would go back and forth every few months until she moved back to Louisiana. According to Lindsay's Facebook, she posted that she had actually bought a place and was coming home to pack and move. That was on May 24th, 2015, and it was an exciting time. Summer was coming up, and there was a lot to do in New Orleans. By June, Lindsay was back in Louisiana and eager to meet up with her girls for a girls' night out. It was Saturday, June 20th, 2015. Lindsay was back in town and ready to party. By 9:30 p.m., she was calling her friends. She called Jessica Ann first. Jessica was in the middle of getting her hair done, but could tell Lindsay was excited to get out and have fun that night. Lindsay's friends knew she was back in town and wanted to cut loose because she had been working so hard. As I mentioned earlier, Lindsay worked 7 days a week, sometimes 12 hours a day. Her job meant she had to travel to different locations doing timekeeping in the construction industry, which can be a pretty fast-paced career. Knowing this, her friends didn't want to let her down. Jessica was ready to celebrate that Lindsay was back in town. She hadn't seen her in quite some time. They decided to go get some drinks and hang out for a while. They went to a sports bar called Gabby's. They also invited Lauren, but she couldn't make it since she couldn't find a babysitter that night. Lauren decided to stay home, saying they could do something another time. Gabby's is located in New Orleans East. There's food, pool tables, drinks, and music. Plus, the girls knew just about everyone in the area, so once they got there, they were bumping into people left and right, saying hello, hanging out, having drinks, and having fun. Usually when the girls go out, Jessica is the one who heads home first. She's kind of looked at as the mom of the group, down to earth, grounded, and cautious. She's the type who has to be home by a certain time. So, as it got later, past midnight, Jessica let Lindsay know that she was planning on heading home. But before they said goodnight, they decided to go to another bar called Spice Bar and Grill. It was about 1 a.m., and they were going there to meet up with another friend, Melanie. Melanie was going to continue hanging out with Lindsay, while Jessica planned to go home. At this point, Jessica was feeling uncomfortable. The night had worn on her, and she'd had enough. She wanted to leave. It wasn't as though Jessica didn't like Spice or the atmosphere. She just felt weird, for whatever reason, and kept telling Lindsay they should call it a night. However, Lindsay, who hadn't been out in a while, wanted to continue partying. Just before Jessica left, a guy named Bam showed up. Bam was someone the girls were familiar with. They had hung out before. He wasn't exactly a close friend, but also not just an acquaintance, someone Lindsay had known for a couple of years. By this point, it was about 1:30 a.m., and Jessica decided to leave while Melanie, Bam, and Lindsay decided to continue the party. It was Father's Day just after midnight, and Lindsay offered to buy Bam a drink and take the group to a strip club. After parting ways with Jessica, the three of them headed to a place called Passion Strip Club. Passion was a local hangout spot in New Orleans East, a rougher part of town. It wasn't an upscale establishment. In fact, it was more of a hole-in-the-wall place, but it was cheap. When I researched it, I found out why. There were a lot of scandalous things happening there, including underage girls coming forward with complaints of really bad things happening to them, even being pimped out to clients. But apparently, Passion had very cheap drinks and a low cover charge, only about $5 to get in. The group of friends decided to go hang out there for a few more hours. I got curious about the place, and you'll see why soon. I went on Yelp, and although Passion was permanently closed by that point, I read through some of the reviews to get an idea of what it was like. The reviews weren't great. With only 6 reviews, it's not a large sample size, but the comments were negative. People mentioned being robbed, pickpocketed, and scammed. It didn't seem like an overall great place to hang out. But one of the reasons people still went there was because it was open until 4. More later, sometimes without any real rules. If you're leaving a bar or club that closes at 1 or 2 a.m. and still want to drink and hang out, you could go somewhere like Passion. So Melanie, Lindsay, and Bam headed over there. As soon as they arrived, Lindsay started greeting people. She knew a lot of people there, both working and hanging out, as they were all locals. Lindsay was very friendly, and when she drank alcohol, she became even more so. Some of us can relate to that. Inhibitions were lowered, and Lindsay, already very attractive, had quite a few guys flirting with her, coming up to her, giving her hugs, saying hello, buying her drinks, and hanging out. At one point, a couple of guys joined their group, and one of them seemed to know Lindsay very well. When he walked into the club, Lindsay ran over to him, gave him a hug, and jumped into his arms. He picked her up, and you could tell they had a strong connection. He was really cute, outgoing, with a big white smile, and his energy matched Lindsay's. They were having a great time together. Everything seemed to be going just fine, and everyone was having fun. As the night went on, well, really it was early morning by then, Lindsay and Bam decided to leave together, leaving Melanie behind. The next morning, or later that same morning, was Father's Day. Lindsay's mom, Jolene, sent her a text to remind her to wish her stepfather a happy Father's Day. When Jolene didn't get an answer back, she wasn't too concerned. She knew that when her daughter went out, she would usually sleep in the next day. However, Jolene soon noticed she had a missed phone call and a voicemail. When she played the message, it was strange and unsettling. The voicemail was from a man who had bought Jolene's home back in Lindsay's hometown. He said that the cops had come by the house looking for the parents of Lindsay Nichols. When Jolene received the strange message that police were looking for Lindsay's parents, her gut told her something was wrong. And indeed, something terrible had happened. To understand the urgency behind the message, we need to go back to earlier that morning when the New Orleans Police Department received a call around 6 a.m. Security officers reported an abandoned, possibly stolen vehicle on Michoud Boulevard in New Orleans East. This area, a desolate stretch of road near the abandoned Six Flags amusement park, didn't raise immediate alarm, so no officers were sent out right away. However, another call came in around 8 a.m. This time, the caller reported that the same vehicle was now on fire. Describing it as a black vehicle with dark-tinted windows, the caller wasn't sure if anyone was inside, so the fire department was dispatched to the scene immediately. When the firefighters arrived, they found that the vehicle wasn't engulfed in flames, but was instead emitting heavy smoke. As they worked to douse the fire, they opened the vehicle doors to let the smoke escape. It was when they reached the trunk that they made a horrific discovery: a human body inside, no longer alive. This shocking find quickly escalated the situation to a homicide investigation, and Detective Robert Barrere, a seasoned and respected homicide detective, was called to the scene. As firefighters halted their work, the investigation officially began. The location, a desolate area surrounded by nature, swamps, and forests with no one around for miles, seemed suspicious. Just 2 minutes away from the now abandoned Six Flags amusement park, it was a place that used to draw thousands of visitors, but now stood isolated. Detective Barrere arrived at the scene to examine the vehicle and its surroundings. Upon opening the trunk, he found the partially burned body of a white woman with blonde hair. Because the fire hadn't fully consumed the car, much evidence was preserved, making it clear this was a deliberate attempt to destroy both the body and any trace of the crime. One key detail that stuck out to investigators was that the fire had been started using lighter fluid bottles, which were still intact in the vehicle. This amateurish attempt at arson left many clues behind, making it easier for Detective Barrere to reconstruct what had happened. The body inside was burned, but not beyond recognition. Her tattoos, one on her arm and another on her hip, were still visible, and investigators soon found a driver's license in the driver's side door. This driver's license led them to preliminarily identify the body as 31-year-old Lindsay Nichols. At that moment, Detective Barrere's mind began to race with questions. What had brought Lindsay to this remote location, dressed in a little black dress fit for a night out in the city, nowhere near any clubs or nightlife? As Detective Barrere processed the scene, he couldn't help but reflect on the personal connection to the case. Having just said goodbye to his own children on Father's Day before responding to this call. Despite the heavy emotional toll, he remained focused on the task at hand. Lindsay's body was discovered in a fetal position, bearing burn marks, but it was evident that she had also been shot. As investigators cleared items from the trunk, they found a firearm, charred but still recognizable. Every clue pointed to a calculated murder, though poorly executed in its cover-up. This gave Detective Barrere and his team a grim window into the final moments of Lindsay's life. Once the photographs were taken, documenting every angle of the vehicle, inside and out, and the surroundings of the crime scene, it was time to remove Lindsay's remains. As investigators handled this difficult task, they were painfully aware that this desolate, smoky trunk had become her final resting place, making the discovery all the more tragic and personal for everyone involved. It's so inhumane and devastating, but the procedures have to be followed. Now they can finally remove her, and when they did, they made an even more horrific discovery. It was obvious that she had been strangled, and there were actually multiple gunshot wounds to her body. How does this beautiful, vibrant, loving, hard-working woman, who's only 31 years old, who's out enjoying friends and having a homecoming of sorts, come face to face with an absolute monster? That's exactly what detectives want to know, and it's crucial that they find out as much as they can as fast as they can. The first 24 to 48 hours are crucial when you're dealing with a homicide investigation. They've already preliminarily identified her with not only her driver's license, but they also went ahead and ran her license plate. The number came back to Lindsay Nichols. They also retrieved an identification lanyard that she would wear around her neck when she was working, and there was a photograph of Lindsay and her son Peter on it. This part was heartbreaking to me. One of the investigators pulled that item from inside the vehicle, and he took note of what it said on the back. It emphasizes safety, and it says, "Why I soar for safety, so why I choose to be safe," and it's a picture of her and her son. It just humanizes the entire situation, because you realize that this person had a family, this person has a son, and she's not coming back to him. One thing that the death investigation technicians were able to ascertain was that her body was in full rigor mortis. It was very stiff, so they estimated that she was killed sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. But at this point, she's transferred to the morgue for a full autopsy. When Lindsay's removed from the trunk, the investigators are able to get inside and collect evidence left behind. They notice there are bullets inside the trunk, leading them to believe that she was shot while she was lying in the back of this vehicle, and the gun was thrown inside, and everything was lit on fire. The handgun used was a Taurus 9mm. You do not have to necessarily be trained in arson to ascertain that an accelerant was used. There is a pattern to the way that something burns. You can tell that something was thrown on top, drizzled, doused. Not to mention the fact that they did recover the actual lighter fluid containers. They were bright yellow in color. It looks as though accelerant was thrown inside the trunk, on top of Lindsay, and on other areas of the trunk, as well as outside the vehicle and inside on the dashboard. All of those areas were then set on fire. It doesn't seem like this person has experience burning a vehicle. It's not a normal skill that we learn in practice. It's actually very difficult to burn a vehicle and also burn a human body, at least not hot enough to demolish them completely. The accelerant was called roncinol. It's a standard lighter fluid, but it's the one that comes in a smaller bottle, and it looks like it's intended to refill something like a Zippo lighter. It's not a big gas can. So, either this individual had this on hand, maybe they're a smoker, or Detective Barrere thought they could have picked it up somewhere like a gas station or a convenience store. So the first thing he thinks of is that they should go to nearby stores that would have been open in the middle of the night. If they sell this type of lighter fluid, maybe they can get a lead. There was something significant recovered from the attempted arson, a plastic bag inside the vehicle. It was burned on the outside, but the contents inside were still intact. That bag contained what appeared to be men's clothing, and they wanted so badly to just rip through that bag and find out exactly what's inside this car. But it had to be towed back to the police headquarters for a more extensive, advanced crime scene investigation, and they needed a search warrant first. Another thing Detective Bearer takes note of is that this seems like a very personal crime. The fact that someone is strangled, put into a vehicle, their own vehicle, driven somewhere and set on fire is a lot. But this really leads him to where a lot of investigations start anyway, and that's with whoever was with the victim last, or the people close to the victim. A boyfriend, someone that she might have been seeing, somebody that could have been upset with her. They need to know everything and anything they can find about Lindsay herself and what she was doing. The first thing, of course, is that they have to notify her family. Now we're back in the original timeline when I told you that Lindsay's mother, Jolene, was notified by the person that she sold her previous residence to, that the police were there looking for the parents of Lindsay Nichols. Jolene called around until she got a hold of the department that was responsible for handling Lindsay's case. Once she was given the information, her only choice was to come down to the morgue the following day to identify her daughter. It's absolutely gut-wrenching to know, as a parent, that there's nothing you can do. You can't protect your child, you can't say goodbye, and you're left with so many questions. And in this case, you're left with a grandson who doesn't have a mother. The word was traveling fast, especially through their small town. One of Jessica and Lindsay's mutual friends called up Jessica and told her to turn on the news because there was a vehicle found on the side of the road that looked like Lindsay's, and it had a deceased body in the trunk. As soon as Jessica turned on the news, she just got this overwhelming, terrible, intense gut feeling and broke down. So many thoughts were going through her head because, at that moment, you don't know if this is your friend. I could imagine thinking, if this was my friend, am I responsible in some way? Did I do something wrong? Did I make a bad choice by leaving her there that night? At this point, we don't even know what happened. We don't even know if Lindsay had spoken to anyone after she left Passions. Because it was the only thing that her friends and family could do, they went to visit the morgue. They were there to support one another, and within 24 hours of her body being found, she was positively identified as Lindsay Marie Nichols. But that's not the hardest part. Jolene had to explain to Peter why his mom wasn't coming home. Peter was 9 years old. Jolene doesn't have experience letting a child know that their mom has been killed. It's not something you can plan for. It's not something you practice, and she didn't know how to break the news. As she was trying to explain it, to say, "Your mommy's been shot, she's been killed," Peter didn't think she was serious because how can a child's mind understand what's going on? I mean, adults have a hard time processing this, and it's all happening so fast, let alone a child's mind that's not even developed yet. I had to listen to Jolene explain this part, and it had me in tears because when they tried to tell Peter, he just kept thinking that they were teasing him, that they were just being funny. It's not something that you would joke about, but again, in a child's mind, he just thought they were being silly. When he finally realized that they were telling him the truth, that this is what really happened to his mom, of course, Peter couldn't handle it. There was just so much crying, so much heartbreak. It's gonna change that child's life forever. I've heard this in other stories that I've done, where family members don't get the chance to see their loved one, they don't get to see the body and say goodbye, so there isn't this closure. Although they've been told their loved one is deceased, they're gone, there's no way for them to close that chapter because they just can't put their hands on them, say goodbye, and see it for themselves. There's just this lingering feeling like, is this really true? Clearly it is in these cases, but I can understand that disconnect of not having that proof, not having that moment where your brain can really wrap around what's going on. One of the biggest questions in everyone's mind is, Who could have done this to Lindsay? Her mom has no clue. She didn't know where she was that night or who she was with. Plus, she couldn't think of anyone who would want to do something so horrific to her daughter. They didn't even know the extent of what happened in this moment because the autopsy wasn't completed. A lot of times, we assume that these investigations move fast, but they don't. What I mean by that is that people don't come forward immediately. Friends and family don't just come right in to talk to police. That's actually not how it usually happens. Detective Bearer has to track down the most credible witnesses, not just anyone and everyone that knew the victim. By this time, it's getting later into the evening. By the time everything was processed and brought back to the station, Detective Bearer says, "You know what? I think we should start with the lighter fluid, because he had that hunch that it could have been purchased nearby. If so, they could pull security footage, which would give them a visual on the suspect. Rather than wait to understand exactly what happened and who Lindsay was with, it's almost their best witness, a camera. You don't have to worry that the camera is lying or didn't remember correctly. It's right there in front of you." So he sets out, going store by store, to ask if this particular lighter fluid was purchased in the last day or so. He's also narrowing it down to a store that would be open 24 hours because, in his mind, this was something spur of the moment. It wasn't planned, especially with how haphazardly everything was carried out. He thought this was something the perpetrator did in the moment, either right after committing the crime or while they were in the commission of this crime. Because of the rigor mortis, he had a preliminary timeline. He went to a number of these stores, and either they didn't sell that brand of lighter fluid, or they hadn't sold it to anyone in the last couple of days. There's also a possibility that the person who committed this crime drove from a far distance to get rid of Lindsay's vehicle, which could mean the convenience store that he's looking for could be far from this area. He doesn't have a lot of time. It's much more important for him to go back to the station and do things he can do from there. One of those things is looking through social media, because these days, with modern crimes happening within the last 10 years or so, we have social media. We have that social media footprint, so we can go backtrack. Maybe Lindsay posted something. There's Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. So that is the next plan of action. Another thing they can get from social media is potential witnesses. Friends who can provide them with more information in an interview-style sit-down meeting the next morning. I feel like investigators do not sleep. It seems like they are always doing something, even at home. Not that they want to bring their work home, but going through social media is something all of us can do right here, right now. We can be armchair detectives. A lot of crimes have been solved recently because of social media. Gabby Petito comes to mind, with the internet coming together to look for clues from all over the country, if not the world. Especially when you're invested in a crime, someone like Detective Bearer, this is their job. They're invested, and they're going to spend hours and hours scouring the internet for clues. I wouldn't say that Lindsay had a big social media presence, but because she was interested in modeling, she did have a lot of photos on her Facebook page. Her Facebook is still up, it's in remembrance mode, but there are a lot of beautiful photos of Lindsay. There were also a couple of posts within the last few weeks, even the last day before the crime happened, that were suspicious, or at least of interest to detectives. This one is from June 8, 2015, and it said, "Some just makes my nerves bad as, so glad I moved and certain people don't know where I live anymore. Just saying." This was only a few weeks before Lindsay ended up dead. What did it mean that she had something getting on her nerves? That she was nervous about something? Was she upset and she was glad that she moved? Was there someone following her, stalking her? And she says, certain people. So who are these certain people or person? Could they have followed her from Texas back to Louisiana? She says she's glad they don't know where she lives anymore, but do they know where she goes out? Do they know the people that she hangs out with? Are they jealous? Do they have ill will toward her? And she's posting this publicly, so did they see this post? These are the questions detectives have to ask, and it's why it's good that social media exists. Sometimes it is a double-edged sword. There's also a photo taken right before this post. It's from the same day, and looks like Lindsay was visiting a bar or a restaurant. You can see TVs in the background. It looks like sort of a bar and grill, like a sports bar. There were 19 comments on this particular photo, so investigators have to go through them. However, there wasn't anything suspicious when they went through those, so they moved on to another post from June 19th, 2015. This was just a day before she went out with her friends. It says, "I've learned something so beautiful from a really messed up situation, so bittersweet and so enlightening. Where do I go from here?" And then there's an emoji of a pen. That's a lot to decipher. I don't know Lindsay. I'm not a detective. It's not my job to sift through, understand, and analyze things like this. But it's clear, because it's in her own words, that she was in a really messed up situation. Although she is saying she learned from it and it's bittersweet and enlightening, the question is, did it involve someone else? Do they see it as enlightening and bittersweet? And there's a pen at the end of her comment, as though she's not done writing her story. However, somebody did close that chapter for her. She didn't know where she was going from there, but we know where she ended up. These Facebook posts were not giving the detectives many leads, but it didn't take long before both Jessica and Melanie, who were with Lindsay the night before, came forward. They came down to the homicide department to be interviewed. It's tough having to recount the moments that you spent with your loved one who is no longer here, but it is so important to provide any and all information you can before you forget everything. Everything you know up until the last point that you saw them is imperative in order to catch who did this. Jessica knows this. She's more than willing to help. She comes in armed with her phone, going hour by hour, letting detectives know step by step what the girls did that night. I already relayed a lot of that information to you. They were at Gabby's until about 1 o'clock, then they headed over to Spice Bar and Grill. Melanie came there to meet them around 1:30 or 1:45. Jessica tells detectives that she wanted to leave. She was tired and uncomfortable. She tells them about Bam, that Bam met them at Spice. While they were still there, Lindsay, Bam, and Melanie took a photo together, which she provided to them. Detective Barrer printed it out. Barrer took note that Bam was a black male, around 6 feet tall, and probably 200 pounds. He definitely needs more information about this man, including his real name. So he presses Jessica about whether Lindsay had any violent relationships in the past, boyfriends. And Jessica almost instantly, before he's even done asking the question, butts in and insists a boyfriend did not do this to Lindsay. She says, "This is not going to be a boyfriend that did this." And she adds that sometimes when Lindsay gets drunk, she becomes overly friendly. Now Barrer needs to speak with Melanie, and Melanie's waiting in another interview room for him to arrive. He needs the timeline to be picked up from where Jessica left off. Melanie tells Barrer she doesn't think they got to Passions until around 3 o'clock in the morning. She explains that Lindsay drove Bam to Passions and that she followed them in her own car. Barrer wants to know more about Bam, and Melanie says she doesn't know him, but she does think that Bam must know something because he was the person that Lindsay left Passions with. Then she plays an audio recording of a phone call between her and Lindsay. By the way, I was confused about how she recorded the call. This had me so mind-boggled. Maybe I'm thinking too hard because I can actually hear it ring in the beginning, and then I hear Lindsay pick up. Melanie's asking her, "Where are you?" But how does she have this recording? Let me know in the comments. How is she recording this? I just had to let that part go because I didn't understand how to do it. I know you can pull up voice messages and all that, but an actual phone call? Lindsay, in her own words, telling Melanie that she's GPSing back to Bam's car. This was after Lindsay and Bam decided to leave. Melanie asks her where she's going after this. She tells her she's going to hang out with her people from the East. She's referring to New Orleans East. Listening to that call, Melanie breaks down because Melanie had said, "Call me if you need me," and then you just hear Lindsay's laugh. That hurts because she did need someone. She may not have thought she would, but she needed someone. She probably felt like she had everything under control in any situation. especially because of this next bit of information that Melanie provides. Lindsay had a gun. Melanie explains that if Lindsay felt safe with you, she would leave the gun in her center console. But if she didn't feel safe, she would keep the gun in the side door of her car and keep her arm down near it. Barra then asks if Lindsay was with anyone else that night at Passions, and she explains that Lindsay must have known a number of people there because she was having all kinds of friendly conversations, hanging out with both dancers and people at the bar. Melanie said that Lindsay must have known this one guy really well because she jumped into his arms when she saw him. However, Melanie has no idea who any of these people are. From the information that Jessica and Melanie provided, Barra has narrowed down the timeline to a 3 to 4 hour period that's unaccounted for. From about 4 a.m. until the first call came into police about someone seeing Lindsay's black Honda Accord on the side of the road. So at this point, the biggest lead they have in this case is that Lindsay left with a man named Bam. They know what he looks like from the photo that Jessica shared with them, and they're able to put his name into the system. They somehow get information about where Bam lives, so they decide they're going to pay him a visit. Right now, everything is pointing to Bam. Either he had something to do with it, or he knows something. There was not a lot of time that passed between the moment they left Passions together and when that car was found on the side of the road. So what happened? The theory at this point is that either Bam wanted to cause Lindsay harm, so they leave together, and something transpires between the time they leave and when they get to Bam's vehicle, or that she brings him back to Spice to get his vehicle, drops him off, and then goes somewhere else, or that someone saw her when she was dropping him off, and that other person causes her harm and leaves her on the side of the road. Another significant point at this time was the gun. Detective Barra believes that Lindsay was possibly shot with her own firearm. The next day, a candlelight vigil is held in Lindsay's memory. Detective Barra attends, not just because he wants to ask questions, because he does, but he wants to see who comes to the vigil. There could be some very important information gleaned from the fact that certain people show up or certain people don't show up. He can size people up, see if they're acting differently, and see if he can find any leads. But he's also there because he cares. Lindsay is not just a number. She's a person, and he shows his respect for her family and for the people she's left behind. All of Lindsay's friends and family are gathered around. They're wearing shirts with her on them and lighting candles in those pink solo cups. Jessica spoke and said that Lindsay's son will never have a mother and that she can't imagine someone having to tell their kids something like that. She would never be coming back, and that Lindsay was the best person. Jessica just prays that she gets justice because no one deserved to die like that, and that's when they let off all the balloons. This was the second night after Lindsay had been found. Right after the vigil is over, Detective Barra doesn't hesitate. He makes a trip over to Bam's. He knocks on the door and just asks, "Are you friends with Lindsay Nichols?" He says yes. Bam actually tells detectives to come inside. The first thing that detectives notice is that Bam is a big man, very big. Once they get to talking with him, they realize they want to sit down for a formal interview, so they ask Bam if he wouldn't mind coming down to the homicide department. He agrees, but says he can only come the next day. The detectives are hopeful he'll show up because they really need more information. He was the last person known to have seen Lindsay alive. Luckily, Bam is true to his word and shows up at the homicide department the next day. Detectives want to know how he knows Lindsay, how long they've known each other, and who she is to him. Bam explains that she's a good friend and that they've known each other for a little over a year and a half. They ask how he ended up with Lindsay that Saturday night. As anyone who watches true crime knows, conversations at a police station are typically recorded, and Bam is aware of this. While he speaks with Detective Barra and his partner, they're also being watched by other detectives in different rooms, who analyze body language, tone of voice, and other details. This approach allows them to gather information efficiently, with one detective in the room collecting information while others research details of the case. Detectives sometimes leave the room and return for tactical reasons or to check in with other investigators. Sometimes additional information can help elicit a confession, so the more information they have, the better. Bam fills in a lot of the blanks during his interview. He mentions that Lindsay texted him around 2 a.m. saying she was at Spice. He thought, okay, cool, and decided to meet her there to hang out for a while. When he arrives, Lindsay suggests they go to Passion's because it's Father's Day and she wants to buy him a drink. Once inside the club, Bam observes that Lindsay starts chatting with a group of young men. While he couldn't hear the conversation due to the loud music, he could tell it was friendly. After they've been there for a while, Lindsay tells him she's going to drop him off. He agrees, and they leave together. She drops him off at his truck in the parking lot at Spice. Detective Barrer asks where Lindsay was going, and Bam says he doesn't know for sure, but that she mentioned hanging out with some friends. He gets back into his truck and looks back, seeing Lindsay driving off toward New Orleans East. This aligns with what Melanie said in the audio recording. Lindsay had mentioned meeting up with her people in that area. At this point, Detective Barrer doesn't hold back. He asks Bam directly, "If you know who did this, or if you're responsible in any way, we hope you'll say it now instead of us having to figure it out later." He directly asks Bam if he killed Lindsay Nichols. Bam insists, "No sir, I promise you if I knew anything, I would tell you." He sounds genuine, calm, well-spoken and concerned about his friend. He expresses that he can't imagine anyone having a problem with Lindsay. She was a good-hearted person. Bam breaks down a bit, saying he's hurting because he knows Lindsay is gone. Frustratingly, it's day 3 in the investigation, and they're no closer to figuring out what happened. However, this is part of the process. Detectives have to eliminate people one by one. They decide to pull some surveillance video from Passion's nightclub to see if there's anything significant on it. They're also in the process of getting that search warrant to search the inside of Lindsay's vehicle and have an advanced crime scene team analyze everything within that car. They're hoping that they're going to find a bigger lead from that evidence. They were able to look inside and see things that they thought would be significant, but they weren't allowed to touch anything in that moment because they had to go through the entire legal process. However, there are things that could be collected. So the very next day, they go down to the headquarters where the car is locked up. They bring out their crime scene photographer to take pictures of everything as they're sifting through it. Many people have a lot of things in their trunk, a lot of things in their vehicles, everyday things like clothing, accessories, and shoes. Lindsay was no different. So it's hard to differentiate between something that might be evidence and something of value and just everyday items that were thrown inside this vehicle. However, I did tell you about a plastic bag that was burned on the outside, but the contents looked as though they were completely intact. From what they could tell, it looked like men's clothing, and that was significant. The crime scene technicians came out. They collected swabs from places like the steering wheel in case anyone else drove the car. There could be DNA on it. They swabbed the trunk, inside the vehicle, on the dashboard, and any other place where DNA or fingerprints could be found. But probably the biggest find during the search of her car was her cell phone and the men's clothing. There was a white tank top, like the wife-beater kind that men usually wear, with a pair of red basketball shorts and a pair of socks. The tank top looked like it had blood on it, and you could clearly see there were red blood stains on the socks. These items were put inside of this plastic bag with the intention that it would be burned with no evidence left behind. The most likely scenario is that the killer was wearing this outfit, and when he was done committing the crime, he undressed, threw his clothes inside, and doused the entire vehicle, including the trunk and Lindsay, with lighter fluid, hoping that the entire car would burn to ashes. Even though these are some significant finds, the DNA analysis takes weeks. So right now, detectives have to do what they can to generate more leads while they are waiting. They go back to the station and look through the surveillance footage from Passions. You can see Melanie, Bam, and Lindsay entering the club. There's also footage of Bam and Lindsay leaving the club together, just like Melanie and Bam had said. Right next to the club is a Shell gas station. It's right here. Bam and Lindsay went there to get some cash out of the ATM before going to Bam's truck. While looking through this footage, detectives are trying to see if there's anything that contradicts the story that Bam gave, or anything suspicious, like, was he waiting for her to take money out? Was he threatening her for the cash? That's not the case, and nothing's out of the ordinary. Just two friends hanging out, getting money out of an ATM. Detectives do not see a motive here when it comes to Bam, so he is pretty much eliminated at this point. They have to wait 2 whole weeks, and nothing's happening in the case. They have no new leads, and it's pretty much a dead end. However, they are about to get some shocking information, and it comes from Lindsay's phone records. Detective Rare is going through Lindsay's call log, incoming and outgoing, and you could not believe what he saw. At 4:45 a.m., Lindsay made a call to 911. This is unbelievable. You're expecting to see a lot of things when you're looking through these phone records, but you are not expecting a victim to have called the police and not been helped. He is so confused. He has to understand more about what happened during this phone call. They know they're going to have to contact the police department and find out what was on that 911 recording. They also pinpoint the last person that Lindsay called that night before the 911 call. There was a number that she called a couple of times, so they go ahead and run it through their system, and it comes up to a man named Theon Sampson. When they checked where he lived, he was from the east. You recall on that phone call, Lindsay said she's gonna hang out with her people from the east. Who is Theon Sampson? Where was he that night? Did he see her that night? Does he have anything to do with the crime? They run his name and are able to find out that this man had convictions for aggravated battery as well as illegally carrying weapons. They also pulled some photos of him and submitted a search warrant so they can pull his phone records. Meanwhile, they go down to the police department where the 911 call center is, and they request to listen to that recording. Get this, when they go over there and pull these records, one of the custodians that was helping them actually shows them that Lindsay provided her full name to the 911 operator. Lindsay tells the 911 dispatcher that she's hiding from 2 men in her car. She had to run away and hide from them because they were trying to get her to perform a sexual act that she was not comfortable with. She didn't want to do that with these men, and after refusing their sexual advances, she ran and hid. They found her in her vehicle, and that's when she was on the phone with 911. She tells them, "I'm gonna have to shoot them." At this point, she has her gun and is in her car, all the while with no officers coming out. Instead, the 911 operator is listening to this crime unfold. It's 2 against 1, and they get her gun. After that, there are some very nasty words that are spewed out of these men's mouths toward Lindsay. Very dehumanizing, disgusting, derogatory, just vulgar statements made toward this woman. Then there is just this extended period of time where you can hear this poor woman struggling to save her own life. After that, the call is dropped. Detective Barra said this is the worst 911 call he has ever heard in his entire career. This woman died, and the operator stayed on to listen to this entire conversation, but there was no one there to help her. These 2 men had gotten a hold of her keys and her gun, and they were threatening to kill her. Not only that, this phone call captures the moments that these men were attacking her. During this call, she also told the operator that she might have to shoot them, that was her only choice, but apparently she never got the chance. The operator asking her, "What does the person look like?" And they're trying to calm Lindsay down, but she's just crying and keeps saying, hurry up, please hurry up." Lindsay pleading with the perpetrators, telling them, please, just put down the gun and give me back my keys. But the saddest thing is that Lindsay is just telling the operator, "I need help, please send someone. I need help, please send someone, hurry." She's saying this over and over again for 8 desperate minutes. I can't even fathom being on an 8-minute phone call and not having someone come to my rescue. At the end of this call, the operator is saying nothing. They're just listening to the sound of Lindsay crying, moaning, and being repeatedly struck. It's horrifying. We think, or at least I do, that when we call 911, we're gonna get saved. We always think that's the most important thing to do. If we can get to our phones, we're safe. We feel like if we hit those 3 numbers and call, we're gonna be okay. But Lindsay was not okay. This is not okay. This operator failed Lindsay Nichols. They did not relay this information to the appropriate and proper departments. It was categorized as a low-level response needed. Low-level, this wasn't even a high priority. So by the time the units arrived, Lindsay and her murderers were gone. It was too late. It is absolutely gut-wrenching to know this, because sometimes we don't know. We have to imagine or guess what someone's last moments were. But to hear them puts it on a different level of sadness. For Jolene, having to hear her daughter in those last moments and knowing how brutal they were is something that haunts her, and it always will. Because sometimes when things happen, we can imagine that they went differently. But you can't escape the truth in this case. You know, there is a commander from the police department who admits that when they make mistakes, people can die. This is a life or death job. You're dealing with emergencies, and you have to take it seriously. Not to say we know exactly what was going on in that dispatcher's mind. We're human, I understand that. But I don't understand how something like this can happen. It's been 4 weeks at this time, and had that connection been made between this call and Lindsay's murder sooner, things would have progressed a lot more quickly. But they do get 40,000 911 calls a month, so that correlation just wasn't made. And unfortunately, because they did have to hear Lindsay say what she did, they got a picture of where she was, where this was happening, because she told the dispatcher that she was near a car dealership. She even described that there were more than one man, and that it seemed like she knew one of them, but she was afraid to tell the dispatcher who she said it was, a guy that she had met once before. Detectives are going to use all of this as evidence and sift through it to see if they can make any more connections. Meanwhile, the autopsy report came back in October. Cynthia Garner concluded that Lindsay suffered 9 gunshot wounds, 1 to the head, 6 to the neck, and 1 to the hand. There was evidence that Lindsay had been strangled and suffered blunt force injury. The burning of Lindsay's body occurred post-mortem. A toxicology report was conducted as well, and it indicated that there was alcohol in Lindsay's bloodstream. Dr. Gardner estimated that the muzzle of the gun was approximately 2 feet away when it was fired, and it was from a 9mm firearm. The shell casings and bullets that were recovered from the passenger area and the trunk area were tested, and it was proved that the weapon they came from was Lindsay's 9mm handgun. The investigation further revealed that Lindsay was shot while in the passenger side of the vehicle, as well as when she was moved to the trunk area. It is absolutely terrifying to be in such close quarters, trapped in your vehicle and killed with your own firearm. The biggest lead Detective Barrera has right now is this guy, Theon Sampson. Lindsay called him right before the hour of her murder, and it's about to get intense because they get a hold of Theon Sampson's phone records. Modern technology is absolutely amazing. We can do things now compared to what we could even do a decade or 2 ago. We can actually pinpoint where someone was, and it's all because of something we never want to put down: our phones. That's the one thing that people who do wrong often overlook: keeping their phones on them. Phones are the most trustworthy witnesses of all. You can't deny where you were. If GPS puts you there, you were there. It turns out they were able to pinpoint exactly where that 911 call came from. According to Lindsay's phone records and GPS coordinates, lo and behold, Theon Sampson's phone pings to the very same location at the same time. So while she's on this 911 call, this man is in the same place. It's pretty obvious, but you know how it goes in criminal investigations. You have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. You don't want to make a mistake. You have to find multiple ways to ensure you can place your perpetrator in that location. As far as detectives are concerned, they have their man, or at least one of them, because we know from Lindsay's phone call that there were 2 men involved in this crime. They definitely want to dig in. They want to gather as much information about Theon Sampson as they possibly can. So where do they go first? They go to social media and find his Facebook page. They discover some very peculiar photos. He's almost always dressed up in costumes. They find out that Theon Sampson is actually a stripper. He has an alias. They just call him Bone. Yep, he travels to different strip clubs and does ladies' nights there and dances. He's pretty well known in the community. You could even say he's kind of a local celebrity. He has a big white smile, a nice physique, and tattoos. We know looks can be deceiving, but he's definitely trying to get the ladies to do whatever he wants. He also has a criminal record, which we spoke about. Detectives have seen enough. Literally looking at these pictures is burning their eyes. They decide the next thing they need to do is call him, and they have his phone number. So they go ahead and give him a call. But here's the thing. They don't want to tip him off. This is crucial because they want him to feel comfortable talking. If they let him know that he's a suspect at this point, he might clam up. He might not answer. He might get away. So they have to be buddy-buddy. They have to act like they're just covering all their bases, reaching out to everyone who might have known Lindsay, very casual. They just want to know, what can you tell us about that night? That kind of thing. Detective Barrera does a fabulous job being nonchalant, very calm. Just like, hey, we heard that you might have seen our victim out and about the other night. Would you mind coming in and just talking to us for 10 to 15 minutes? We're interviewing everyone, no big deal. Just want to know if you bumped into her that night. It works. Theon agrees to come down to the NOPD. He says, yeah, I'll let you know what I know about Lindsay, and he is just calm, cool, and collected on the phone. He doesn't even sound like he's worried at all. He just says, okay, cool, I'll come in. But what he doesn't realize is he just added one more piece of concrete evidence to their case against him. The fact that he answered the phone. By simply answering that call, he confirmed that this is his phone. That's the number that pinged, where Lindsay made that 911 call, and now it's connected to him. Now I can't play you this entire interview, but I will just say this. I didn't like the way he acted. He was smug. He knew right away who they were questioning him about. He says, I don't know her last name, but her first name is Lindsay. They asked, do you know what happened to her? And he literally says, yeah, she burned. That bothered me because he thought that she was going to be burned. He thought he was going to get away with this. It just bothered me that he would say it that way instead of she died or she was murdered. He says she was burned. One question about how Lindsay knew Theon. He said that she would come in and watch him dance at the places he went for ladies' nights. He says, yeah, I'm an exotic dancer. And then, this is just something that made my skin crawl. It's these kinds of statements I do not like. I don't even know if you could call it bragging, but I've seen it in other cases with different perpetrators, just the way that they carry themselves. He says, oh well, you know, it doesn't really pay great. However, you get more cat than anything. Wow, okay, we know you're good looking, you've got a great physique, you're an exotic dancer living the life, but you're the suspect in taking someone's life, so be serious. But he's not, and this was just shocking. Just wait. Because you're going to hear me tell you something that he did in this interview that was disgusting. Just wait. Detective Barrera has been doing this for 15 years at this point. He's seen it all. But you just wait, because even he was caught off guard. They asked Theon how he ended up running into Lindsay that night, and he says, I saw her at Passions. This time, he's not dancing, he's actually hanging out and drinking, which might have been a little bit different because usually he is on stage when Lindsay sees him. She recognized him, so when she came in, as soon as they locked eyes, she ran up to him and gave him a hug. For the rest of the night, he said that he was flirting with her. He admits he was flirting and wanted to see what was up with her, what she wanted to do. That was his intention. He says that she told him she would call him later. All the while, he is totally calm while saying this. It's like he's explaining what he ate that day. He's able to look the detectives right in the face and say, that is the last time I saw her. So that puts them together around 4 o'clock in the morning while they're still at the club. They know that Lindsay called him after 4, so they asked him, did she ever call you? He said, yeah, she called me. I don't know what time it was though, because I didn't answer. They said, well, where were you? And he responds, I was at home. They asked, did you go anywhere else that night? He says, no, sir. Now, he does something tricky here. They ask Theon, did you have your phone on all night? And he doesn't hesitate. He says, yeah, I had my phone all night. I always have my phone. They ask, no one else had your phone? He goes, no. Now, what he doesn't understand is that he's confirming that no one else could have been where that 911 call was made because he was with his phone. Detective Barrera does another little buddy-buddy thing and says, you know, everybody I've been interviewing today has been giving me DNA samples, so Theon agrees to do it as well. But here's the crazy part of the interview, at least from my perspective. When Detective Barrera goes to leave the room to get the DNA kit so he can take this monster's DNA, this narcissistic fool is so conceited and smug that he asks if he can take a selfie. Are you serious? He's like, hey, can I take a picture in here? Literally taking a selfie in the interview room. This cannot be real. All the while, other detectives can see everything that's going on in the room, and they're just looking at him like he's a specimen under a microscope, because it's so peculiar to see someone just taking selfies, smiling shamelessly, thinking that this is funny, that it's a joke. This is someone's life, and you're suspected to be involved in taking that life. I don't think he ever thought he was going to get caught. Getting that DNA sample was huge, because they wanted to compare it to the DNA found on the men's clothing. Remember the tank top and the basketball shorts? They really want to get a match, because as soon as they know that it's a match, which they suspect it is, they can arrest this man. Meanwhile, the detectives want to ask Lindsay's friends if they know anything about Theon. Jessica says yes, they met him 3 months ago while they were out on a girls' night. They were at a place called the Tiki Hut. That's where they ran into Theon for the first time. Here's the thing. He and Lindsay had chemistry right away. They were both really good-looking people. They were outgoing. Like I said before, their energies matched. That was the guy I was referring to who came into Passions, the one she ran up to and gave a big hug. He picks her up off the ground. They had the same outgoing personalities. They got along really well. So how do things go so wrong? Because that night, everything seemed to be going right. They exchanged numbers, hung out together, and exchanged texts here and there over the next few months. There's something else about Theon. He was used to getting what he wanted, all the cat he wanted, anytime he wanted it. He goes to ladies' nights, and I don't know if you've ever been to one of these performances, but it's very provocative. There are women who are touching these men. A lot of them let you do it. They're up on that stage getting anything they want, and it seems like he really wanted Lindsay. Further information shows that Theon's apartment is located on the same road as the Chevrolet dealership. It's right nearby, and that is where the initial 911 call came from. This is not too far away from Passions. Look at this. It's a 2-minute drive. This Chevrolet dealership is only 5 minutes away from Theon's apartment. This could have been a place where Lindsay was used to parking when she comes to Passions, because this parking lot is right across the street. Here's the Shell station, and right next to the Shell is Passions. It makes sense she might have parked there, and that's why her vehicle was there. Almost a month had gone by at this point, and detectives are eager to put the people responsible for Lindsay's murder behind bars. Her friends are terrified. They can't carry on their normal everyday activities because they don't know who did this. They are close to Lindsay. What if they're next? What if someone is just waiting for them? What if someone thinks that they know something if they've been a witness? It's a scary time. A lot of times we don't think about the people who are left behind, who are waiting for someone to be arrested so that they're not thinking this murderer could be right around the corner watching them. That is exactly why social media can be so helpful. Theon actually gives his DNA to detectives, and while they're waiting, they decide to take a peek at his Instagram. When they do, they can't believe what they find. It's laughable, not in a funny way, but in a crazy way, because you would think that if you just committed a brutal crime and you knew what you were wearing while committing that crime, You might want to delete the pictures of you wearing it a week before. But not Theon. There he is. This is him wearing the same tank top and basketball shorts, the exact same basketball shorts the covered, and one red basketball shorts. You can't miss it, they're the same. Detectives are actually blown away. This is a 30-year-old man who doesn't have the wherewithal to understand the magnitude of him leaving this evidence in plain sight. But that's because I think he was so confident that she was burned, which means his clothes would also be burned. Keep in mind the media doesn't know or isn't releasing every detail of this crime. Theon probably thought everything within that vehicle was completely burned. He might not realize how he's implicating himself over and over again without doing anything. Detectives are laughing when they see this, not because it's funny, but because this man is cocky enough, confident enough, or even naive enough to think that he's going to get away with this. They didn't have to guess for long about the shorts because the DNA results came back. It was a match. Theon was wearing those shorts. They have their man, one of their men. They still have to find perpetrator number 2, but right now they are on the hunt for Theon Sampson to put him in handcuffs and bring him to the police department. They actually track him down at a tattoo shop. They walk right in, see his car outside, and walk in to arrest him. He just looks surprised. He looks shocked. He's just sitting there getting a tattoo, and it's just crazy to me how this man can go on with his life after just taking someone else's. He can just go back to his normal everyday routine, getting tattooed, probably hooking up with girls, dancing like it didn't even matter at this point. Detectives are hoping Theon gets something else permanent, a jail sentence. They don't hesitate. They bring him into the station under arrest for the murder of Lindsay Nichols. This time, Theon is acting completely different. He's got his head down on the table asking, "Why am I here? Why are you trying to pin this on me?" Detective Barrera says, "Because you did it. Because you did this murder, that's why." But he's keeping his cool. He just tells him, "Listen, here's the thing. You couldn't have been home because we found your clothing on the front seat of her vehicle. There could be a way for you to explain why they were there, but only you know that." He keeps saying, "No, I was at home," and they say, "Well, you could give us the name of the other guy." He replies, "I wasn't with anyone." Then he says he's going to need an attorney and asks for one, so they couldn't get any more information. Now, get this. This is probably my favorite part about Detective Barrera being on this case, and why I like him so much. Not only because he's a veteran detective and so good at his job, but because he does his job in such a memorable way. He hates criminals just as much as I do. When Theon is being arrested and put into lockup, they are putting his hands behind his back with the handcuffs. Officers are standing by his side. He's being taken away and locked up. While this is happening, while he's in this vulnerable position, Detective Barrera says, "Hey buddy, you need to go for one last selfie before you leave." I couldn't help it. It is funny to me because he's making him feel this small. It's about time that an ego as big as his is made to feel as small as he really is, because only a weak and disgusting person could carry out this type of crime. The fact he was able to get that one last jab at him made me happy. Once her friends were informed about the arrest, it was sad to think that it had something to do with the fact that she wouldn't do something sexual in nature. But isn't that how a lot of these crimes occur? They don't know everything. The investigation is not over. But knowing how senseless this was, and how this little boy is left without a mother, how these men just disregarded the fact that this is a person, regardless of whether she just doesn't want to do something with you, I just don't know how it could escalate to that point. But you're going to find out when detectives go back through Theon's phone. There's another number he's communicating with around the same time on the night of the crime. They run that phone number, and it's a match to a man named Troy Vernado. Now they have to look into this person. But before they do, they get an anonymous tip from Crime Stoppers. On the morning the vehicle was found, a tip was called in anonymously by someone who saw two men next to that Honda Accord. They gave a perfect description of Theon. They said he had a mohawk, tattoos, and a nose ring, and they saw him at the trunk of her car. Then he gets into a Jaguar, Well, it turns out Troy owns a Jaguar. By the time Detective Barrera wants to bring Troy in for questioning, he already has a lawyer. The reason being, when Theon's attorneys found out that they were implicating Troy, they had their client give a statement. You can probably guess what Theon said. He blamed everything on Troy. Troy was the one that did it. I didn't have anything to do with it. Then Troy's lawyers come back and say, no, he knows what happened, he knows everything that happened, but he wasn't involved. One of the most frustrating things when it comes to murder cases like this is getting to the truth. That's what the victims' families want to know at the end of the day, because nothing is going to bring back their loved one. But they want to know the truth, and they want the people that are responsible off the streets for good. With all the evidence and the eyewitness accounts, along with the Jaguar description and the description of the people who match both Troy's and Theon's appearances, they were both indicted on second-degree murder. Both of these men went to trial. The prosecution was able to theorize about what happened that night, so I want to tell you what they put together. They say that Lindsay dropped Bam off at his truck, so she did leave Passions. She gets a call from Theon around 4:18 a.m. GPS has her at his apartment complex, so they must have agreed to meet up there. She arrives around 4:30 a.m. At this point, Theon's text message records indicate he texts Troy and lets him know Lindsay arrived. Troy was actually waiting outside at this point, and Theon says, "Come up," telling him that the apartment door is unlocked. Theon is trying to arrange a threesome between Lindsay, himself, and Troy. This happened shortly before Lindsay runs out of the apartment, barely dressed. Something happened when that man came into the apartment. By interviewing some of Lindsay's friends, they suggest most likely she didn't know that man. She doesn't know Troy, and she didn't agree to have him involved in any kind of sexual act, so she runs, and these two men run after her. Of course, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. For one thing, they don't know how someone got a hold of her car keys. They don't know if they were dropped on the ground while she was running away, or if they caught her and grabbed her keys. But by 4:45 a.m., she makes that 911 call. And GPS places her vehicle in that parking lot at the Chevrolet dealership. Lindsay was trying to hold the door shut, and they had the keys. She couldn't hold on anymore, and they got in and attacked her. At some point, she was placed into the trunk of her vehicle after being manually strangled. At 5 a.m., GPS puts her phone, Theon's phone, and Troy's phone all going in the same direction. Theon is driving her vehicle, followed by Troy in his Jaguar. They drive to several desolate areas, almost like they're trying to decide where to leave her, and they finally drive all the way out, near the area near Six Flags. That's where the vehicle was finally located, and she was shot multiple times in the neck while in the trunk of her vehicle. They really don't know the exact sequence of events, but this is the most probable situation. Then they doused the car with lighter fluid and attempted to set it on fire. Theon jumps in Troy's vehicle and jets off. The trial commenced on September 17, 2018, 3 years after these men were arrested. They followed a Facebook page called Justice for Lindsay Marie. I saw all the information about how many times this trial was delayed for all kinds of reasons, often just these two men playing with the legal system. Theon and Troy were charged with second-degree murder, second-degree kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Troy was charged with an additional crime of accessory after the fact. Both men entered a plea of not guilty. Theon decided he would plead guilty to manslaughter and was given that plea deal, sentenced to 40 years in prison. They did try to get Troy to take a plea deal, but he said no. He decided to go to trial, and that wasn't a very good idea. He ended up getting life in prison for second-degree murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Jolene definitely didn't hold back when Troy was on trial. She said that she hopes he burns in hell and that the 911 call haunts her every single day of her life. She hopes it haunts him too, but she doubts it will because this man would never admit that he did anything. In fact, this really bothered me. I'm going to end this in just a moment, but I have to tell you this. He said, "I just want to say this isn't justice for Lindsay. justice would be getting the people who have done this. He added, "For what it's worth, I know what you're going through." Really? The reason he said this was because the mother of his own children died 2 years before this. But that's not what's happening here. To have the audacity to minimize the situation makes me sick. Everyone was impacted by this. Jessica said that day changed her whole opinion of people in this world. Why do bad things seem to happen when we least expect it? You go to school, graduate, and work hard for your future, not knowing how short your life will actually be or whether someone in your life will take it away from you. This case is one that stuck with me, and I really wanted to share it with you. It's just another one that I cannot fully comprehend because of how heartless and heinous it was. This case takes place in Farmersville, Texas. It's a small community around 45 miles away from Dallas, and it's a pretty rural community. The people who live there usually left their doors wide open. They didn't lock their doors. Everybody knew each other. And the events that occurred happened right in the middle of Town Square downtown, which is considered a really safe neighborhood. At one point, this was actually called the onion capital of the state of Texas. The residents still held on to their old-fashioned values. This is where Rochelle O'Neill Tolson lived. Rochelle was born on January 20th, 1984, in Garland, Texas. Her parents are Mark and Pam O'Neill. Growing up, her family and close friends either called her Shell or Shelly Belly. Rochelle and her family were very well known and loved within their small community. A couple of other things I found out about Rochelle were that she loved the color lavender and hated carnations because they reminded her of funerals. She always walked around with a huge smile on her face. She was just known to be a very happy person. Everyone that met her loved her, and they had only good things to say about her. She was 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds. She had shoulder-length brown hair and these really pretty brown eyes. I love brown eyes, and they were these deep, dark, soulful brown eyes. Although Rochelle was a really happy girl growing up, she did have her fair share of the typical hardships that many teenagers experienced. But that did not stop her from having a close relationship with her family, especially her mother. They would hang out, give each other pedicures, and Pam knew how much Rochelle loved Christmas. It was her favorite holiday, so they wouldn't miss a chance to make it special. They even recorded it on video, and I have some of those clips to show you throughout this video. Rochelle loved that time of year so much. She would actually play Christmas CDs year-round. But she also really liked music of the 70s, especially the Carpenters, even though that was a little bit before her time. Just like being in a small town, the school community was even smaller. All the students were close, but Rochelle got particularly close to a boy named Andrew Tollison. They became high school sweethearts, and then they ended up getting married. Soon after, Rochelle got pregnant. When she was pregnant, everyone would tease her because she was so tiny and her belly was so big against her small frame. As it got bigger and bigger, it was hard for her to walk, so she sort of waddled around. It was cute. It wasn't too long before her and Andrew had a baby girl, and they named her Avery Lynn Tollison. Lynn was also Rochelle's middle name. Rochelle and Andrew were practically children themselves. Rochelle even still enjoyed playing with Barbie dolls, dressing them up in cute outfits, and giving them hairstyles to match. Being so young, married with a newborn, without that much life experience or relationship experience, made things really difficult, to say the least. At first, things were great. You're truly in that honeymoon phase. They loved each other so much, having grown up together. That love was truly never going to fade. But what usually does is the patience, the butterflies, and then couples start to resent one another. We can't know for sure exactly what transpired, but when Avery was around 5 months old in 2004, things really started to fall apart for the Tollisons. Rochelle was only 20. It seemed like she may have wanted more out of her life, and she talked about the possibility of going to college to pursue a career in teaching. At the time, some of Rochelle's hobbies consisted of scrapbooking and putting together a beautiful baby book of all the memories of her, Avery, and Andrew, so that Avery could cherish it when she got older. Avery was her life. She was completely dedicated to her. She loved her more than anything, and she would have sacrificed so much for her. The one thing she wasn't 100% willing to compromise on was the relationship with Avery's father. For now, anyway. Rochelle confided in her mother about wanting a divorce. She just wasn't happy anymore. She needed to move on. But Andrew didn't want any of that. He wanted to be a family together, all together with Rochelle and Avery. They were separated until they could figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, Rochelle was living alone with 6-month-old Avery near the middle of town. They were surrounded by everyone they knew. It felt safe. It felt right. Rochelle had grown up there, and she intended to raise her daughter there as well. Andrew and Rochelle were estranged. The divorce was not easy. Andrew told Rochelle he was going to get full custody of Avery. Of course, Rochelle wasn't having it. She would fight to keep her daughter no matter what. Though she told her friends that things weren't that bad, they were just things that couples go through when they break up. It was still really difficult and really up in the air. We're going to jump to the night of Wednesday, March 17th, 2004, around 9 p.m. Rochelle and her mom, Pam, were running around. They were shopping and doing their errands, grabbing things for Avery at the grocery store like formula and diapers. They left and went to Pam's house, staying out for a little while. Rochelle wasn't feeling well. She started to complain that she had somewhat of what felt like a sinus headache. So her mom gave her some medicine for it, but then Rochelle just said, "I want to be home. I want to be in my own bed." So she left, and once she got home, she called Pam to let her know that they had arrived safely. It wasn't until the next morning that things became confusing and worrisome. It was around 7:30 a.m., a nice warm morning in the springtime, a beautiful day, a day that seemed normal, but it wasn't. Pam stopped by to say hello to Rochelle and Avery as part of her normal routine. When she pulled up in the driveway, she saw Rochelle's car there. She walked up to the door, and the first thing she noticed was a note taped to the screen. It was to Rochelle from her landlord, and that seemed a little bit unusual. But what's even more unusual was that the front door, just behind the screen, was wide open. Pam didn't hesitate. She went right inside and began to call out for Rochelle while making a beeline towards Rochelle's bedroom. Pam saw a pillow in the middle of the floor, right outside the bedroom and in front of the kitchen. That's definitely out of place. When she made it inside the door to Rochelle's bedroom, that's when she got her first shocking surprise. Something was out of place. Not something, someone. Avery, baby Avery, was just lying on the bed by herself, a 6-month-old just lying there with Rochelle nowhere in sight. Avery's diaper was soaked, she was cold and all alone. Something was definitely wrong. Pam's eyes started darting around the bedroom. She was taking in every detail, and it was a mess. Not just a mess from being lived in as a mother with a 6-month-old, a mess as though something had happened there. There were papers all over the floor. Pam noticed the nightstand wasn't where it usually was. It was not against the wall, but was pushed out like someone had tried to hide behind it. The bed was moved. The mattress and the box spring were off-center, as though someone had pushed them to the side. The bed frame was even more out of sorts. It was broken and was just leaning up against the mattress. All the while, Pam was calling Rochelle's name in a panic, and there was no answer. She looked everywhere. In the closets, under the bed, in every room in the bathroom, all over Rochelle's house, and she was nowhere to be found. What she did find was Rochelle's purse. That would really lean towards Rochelle not just walking away on her own. If that was her choice, why wouldn't she bring her purse or use her own car? Pam was frantic. She called her husband and told him what was going on, and he contacted the police right away. Police found Rochelle's bedroom exactly the way Pam had described it, in disarray. There were items thrown around, the furniture wasn't in the right places, and it appeared as though someone had been running around like they were being chased. It was definitely an indication that there was some kind of struggle that occurred. They noticed that one of Avery's bottles of milk, which was half empty, was also on the bed. The rest of the home appeared to be pretty organized as usual. They noted that the windows and the doors had not been broken into. All of the lights in the house were on when they came in, as though they had been on since the previous night. The TV was still playing in the living room. There was a pile of clean clothes that were half folded and open food. This just wasn't like Rochelle. She wouldn't have just left all this stuff out, and she definitely would not leave Avery. She wouldn't even go into another room without taking Avery, so there was no question she did not leave on her own. They stumbled upon one of their first real clues: divorce papers. It's not as if the divorce papers themselves raised any red flags. It was what was on one of them, a large shoe print, bigger than any shoe that would belong to Rochelle, and it looked like someone might have purposely stomped their foot down on it. This is when police thought someone else must have been in Rochelle's house. Pam called up Rochelle's estranged husband, Andrew, to let him know what was happening. She was probably scared, worried, and shocked. When he picked up, she told him, "We cannot find Rochelle anywhere." To her surprise, Andrew didn't seem to care. He said, "I'm busy at work, too busy to deal with it, and I can't leave work," so he just kind of left it at that. You know what I'm thinking, and it's true in this case. Like many others, the first person they're going to look at is the person closest to the missing person, and that's always the first suspect. In this case, police were interested in Andrew right away, because after all, he was the one that didn't want the divorce. He wanted custody of the baby. But officers still needed to begin canvassing the entire neighborhood, questioning every resident within the vicinity of Rochelle's house. They were quick to put a search party together. It was time to set up checkpoints, look into cars, and comb through backyards and fields. The entire town sprang into action. They had people on horseback, ATVs, and officers walking side by side in fields. The search party was huge. This extensive search went on for almost a week, and after 5 days, there was still no sign of Rochelle anywhere. The people who knew Rochelle didn't believe for a second that she would have run off and left Avery behind. But there were some residents who didn't know her very well and chalked it up to her being stressed from the divorce and wanting to just get away. Maybe it was postpartum or mental health issues, which I don't blame them for actually thinking. But Rochelle's family knew that was completely impossible. The people who lived the closest to her thought there was no way this was a random situation. They thought it was definitely someone she knew that took her. Statistics point to the people being closest to you as the ones who are more likely to harm you, someone you know. That's exactly why the police still suspected that Andrew would have a motive. If you look at this Christmas video I'm about to play, you can tell that Rochelle has a bit of an attitude towards Andrew, and they were still trying to do their best. Many people close to the couple said they were definitely going through a lot of issues, and Andrew should definitely be their prime suspect. Police didn't really see anyone else who would have anything to gain by doing something to Rochelle, but Andrew could have things much easier if she was out of the way. It would make it more likely that he would get his daughter, and he could move on. They immediately brought him in for questioning, and they were not going easy on him. They were going hard, accusing him right away. "Did you have anything to do with her disappearance?" He said no, but of course he was shaken and fearful, but he wasn't admitting to anything. As a matter of fact, he told them, "Hey, you need to give me a lie detector test because I have nothing to do with this." The police weren't going to go there, but because Andrew had suggested it, and he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he wasn't going to leave the police station unless they took him away in handcuffs or gave him a polygraph, they administered the test. Before they did, they had already interviewed many of Andrew's friends who said he had a jealous side. After all, his relationship was falling apart. The process was a long one. They brought him into the interview room, and it seemed like they were there for an eternity. Again, they were not going easy on him, but they finally concluded the test and then had to wait for the results to come back. Investigators did not know what to think because the results were inconclusive. They were more confused than ever, but since they had such a long interview, they did gather so much information that they were able to get a warrant. This way, they could possibly rule him out by looking through his home and his car to find out whether there was anything left behind that could point to him being connected to her disappearance. Now, the case was everywhere. It spread over the news, it was in the newspapers, and more people were showing up to help with the search. Thousands of people were coming together all over Texas and even further. They really wanted to look for this young mom. I think it really hit home for many people. The police didn't really know whether this was a case of a missing person who had been taken, or a woman who might have had something going on, some other plans, or even more sinister. But their job was to find out. These search parties went on 24 hours a day all week, turning up nothing. Her family was just holding on to the possibility that they were going to find her. After the polygraph, Andrew just fell off the face of the earth. He wouldn't talk to anyone. He was completely distant and didn't seem interested in what was going on. Besides, he had given the police an alibi. Everybody handles these situations in a different way. It would make sense that he was distraught over the fact that the mother of his daughter is missing, a woman that he's loved and grew up with. But they still had their suspicions, even though he gave them an alibi because she was last seen the night before, around 10:30 p.m., at her mom's house, leaving to go back home. She had called her mom to let her know she actually got home. It seems like the disappearance had to have happened between the time she talked to her mother and the next morning when her mom came over. That's not that many hours. We're estimating 10:30 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. Andrew told police, "I couldn't have had anything to do with it because I was in Blue Ridge attending a party." He said he was there all night long, getting totally obliterated, taking his mind off everything that was happening in the relationship, and that his friends drove him home. He got to his house around midnight that night. He says, "I never left the house, and the next morning I went to work." And he did go to work. They knew that was true. His work confirmed that. The problem is, there's no way to corroborate his whereabouts when he was home alone. If no one's there, how is that evidence that you were? This still gives someone 6 or 7 hours to go over to Rochelle's and take her, and there was no forced entry, so he could have easily gotten in. They still could not rule him out as a suspect. Now they had to find out who was at this party. They needed to contact them so they could confirm his alibi. After they interviewed as many people as they could find, his alibi turned out to be not exactly 100% solid. However, his family was home, and they did confirm he came into the house. There was still a gap of time where anything could have happened. They could have seen him when he got home, but then he could have left, and they could have been sleeping, and no one would have noticed. It wasn't a good thing that he was completely intoxicated, because it was to the point where people were saying he couldn't even think straight. It had been 6 whole days since Rochelle had gone missing, and this is when the case took a turn, definitely not in the right direction. A man named James Powell was in an area called Brushy Creek near a creek bed, and he was walking along this little trail near the creek looking for arrowheads to collect. That's when something caught his eye. When we see something that doesn't look right, our brain does try to connect the pieces and put together this puzzle of possibility. What could it be? But we know when something is more than just an item. As he got closer, he saw what he thought looked like feet sticking out under some bushes. Of course, no one wants to, but he moved closer and closer, and when he did, he was just within a few steps of what he thought was a human. He followed the foot to a leg, and then he realized he was looking at human remains. This was about 10 miles from Rochelle's home. James was frantic. He ran to call the police, and when they spoke to him, he was completely shaken up. He was frightened. He could hardly get the words out of his mouth. He just knew what he had seen, and he told the police to get there as soon as they could. Investigators are trained. They know what to look for right away. They found what they were looking for. There were human remains. It was a body laying face down in the dirt. Not only that, they could tell the body had been burned. It was disturbing. The remains were partially clothed. There were clothes that were almost burned into the skin, but there was nothing from the waist down. They also noticed that there was something tied around one of the ankles, and it looked to be some kind of rope. There were all kinds of leaves and branches that were broken and put on top. They were actually pulled out from the area around it because you could see there were missing spots where weeds were pulled up and trees, small trees were pulled up and branches were put on top. They started to worry that they might have just stumbled upon Rochelle and that the body had not been there very long. They could tell it was still in the early stages of decomposition. Everything was just haphazardly put there. Unfortunately, the remains were charred beyond any type of recognition. What they could figure out at that point was that this was not where the fire happened. They thought they could tell the body was female, but as far as being able to positively identify the body, that would come later. The remains were sent to the medical examiner's office, and meanwhile investigators were still combing through that area. They stumbled upon something about 100 yards away from where the remains were, and it was a fire pit. Now this wasn't unusual, because this particular area drew in a lot of teenagers and local 20-somethings, and they would have parties there. It was a well-known party area for drinking and hanging out with friends. There wasn't much to do in this small town, and it was nice to get together there. They were under these oak trees. It gave you a lot of privacy and room for a really large group of people to gather. However, they could tell there were remnants of a fire, but not in the fire pit. It was sort of off a little bit in a different area, and that really stood out to detectives. Now they wanted to understand, why wouldn't the fire be in the center of the pit like usual? They started going back and forth between where the remains were found and this other fire. They realized there was a path through the dirt between those two areas that looked like something had been dragged. They put 2 and 2 together and figured out that the rope was probably around the ankle to be able to easily drag the remains. Of course, they couldn't keep this quiet for long, but they wanted to at least get the chance to make sure they could positively identify the remains before Rochelle's family heard about anything. That didn't go as planned. Pam's brother was notified by a news station, Channel 4, that they found something out in the creek area. He ran right over. He doesn't hesitate. He's not supposed to be there, but he had to know more. Even though they haven't identified the remains, the family just feared the worst, because this was happening around the same time Rochelle disappeared. It hadn't been there that long. It just did not sit right with them, and they were heartbroken before they even found out whether or not this was Rochelle. Sometimes you just know, and her family felt like they just knew what the outcome was going to be. They still hung on to hope. They really didn't have to wait that long though, because they were quickly able to identify the remains through dental records, and sadly, and unfortunately, it turned out that these charred remains belonged to Rochelle. The hardest thing that the officers had to do at this point was to let the family of this 20-year-old beautiful girl know that they found their daughter in the worst way possible. When someone is found deceased, yes, it's so hard that the officers have to notify the family. But usually, or typically, the family gets to identify their loved one. They get to see their loved one. Just the fact that the condition of the body was not in the position to allow for that made me so upset. The police had to give them one piece of bad news after the next, and let them know she's part of a crime scene and you can't look at her, you can't come see her, you can't hug her or hold her, touch her, and you can't even say goodbye. How they found out that this crime seemed to be motivated by sex was before she was deceased. Someone had forced themselves upon her, and there was direct evidence of that. This was not consensual because of what they found and the damage. Most of her hair had been burned. Her clothes were charred in a way where they were sticking to her. There was that orange rope around her right ankle. And then they found 2 grommets from a tarp lying on the back of her left leg and under her head. There was a tarp they found nearby which was also burnt, and they found several pieces of it like it had torn when it was being pulled throughout the path. And this is just, I guess I don't even have to mention what they found at the fire pit because there's no other place that this could have happened. But just to make 100% sure that it was the smaller fire and not inside the fire pit, they did go and have to sift through all the ashes, and they found pieces of the tarp and the orange rope and skin and hair and things like that. They still can't confirm where the incident happened. They now know where the burn site is, and most likely the fire was to conceal whatever happened before that. There was a 5-inch bruise on her left knee, and then there was a smaller one that was in front of her left thigh. There was also a big hemorrhage of some kind on her shoulder, injuries to her scalp from 3/4 of an inch to 3 inches, and deep wounds as well, particularly in her neck and her spinal column. Upon further investigation during the autopsy, they realized that there must have been asphyxiation in this case. That was the cause. It wasn't easy for anyone, even the medical examiner, to look at Rochelle's remains. It was devastating. No one could even believe that what they were looking at now used to be this beautiful, vibrant young mother who had her whole life ahead of her. This is something that was going to stick with them for the rest of their lives. They said that one of the injuries was so deep that it chipped her spine. This was done out of rage. Her parents went from being so happy about their daughter getting married and having a baby to planning for her funeral. A funeral for your child. It was at First Baptist Church. There were so many people there to support the memory of Rochelle's life and to support her family. But so many questions remained. How do neighbors that are so close to you hear nothing in the middle of the night? No screams, no struggle. They didn't see anyone. How is that possible? They found out something that piqued their interest and turned the investigation back towards Andrew once again. Remember his alibi that he was at a party? Well, guess what kind of party it was? It was a bonfire. Obviously, this is a link. They found the charred remains of his estranged wife, and he's at a bonfire the exact same night. Right after she was identified, Andrew refused to talk to anyone. He became a complete hermit. Again, in my mind, I'm thinking this might be a typical reaction, because we all grieve in different ways, but it just doesn't seem like it was adding up. More and more red flags are popping up in his direction, so investigators decide it's within their best interest to see if the logs from the bonfire party that he was at were the same as the ones that were found in the pile where the remains were. They grab a bunch of logs from the party and the crime scene, sending them in for forensic testing, hoping that they could find some kind of connection. It turns out that both groups of logs were mesquite firewood, a type of wood used for slow burning. It doesn't produce a lot of smoke. People use it for things like a bonfire, where you just want to have the fire going and be around it without inhaling all the smoke and being covered with soot. They also use it for cooking and grilling food. Other people in this area use these kinds of logs all the time. They're sourced from local businesses, and these logs could have come from anywhere. They could have come from the same place, and there was no real way to tell whether they came from the same tree or the same person, or whether someone had brought them from one place. Where the logs of the crime scene were, there were way too many questions and not enough answers. You've probably seen this before, but sometimes they can cut the log and look at these tree rings, but not in this type of wood. Instead of rings, there were almost these little veins that ran through, so it was just impossible. They really thought they were onto something, but they had to move on. What it did do was make even more circumstantial evidence that pointed towards Andrew. Rochelle's house was still being sifted through. They collected the divorce papers, but then after reading through them, they realized that they weren't Rochelle and Andrew's documents. They belonged to Rochelle's uncle, Robbie. That seemed a little peculiar, but it turns out that her uncle had already gone through a divorce, and because Rochelle was trying to sort everything out, especially with the visitation concerning Avery, she just asked her uncle to borrow the divorce papers so that she could figure out a way to make everything make sense. She was hoping that she and Andrew could come to some kind of agreement. They find something else when they're examining the divorce papers, a shoe print. They were taken and brought into the lab for further examination. Of course, I'm not a scientist, but they use some kind of chemical that reacts with the partial shoe print, and they're able to bring it up so that it's much more distinctive. They thought, okay, well, if we have a suspect at some point, we can go through all their shoes if they didn't throw them out, and we can see if it's a match. It looked like it was a boot print. Something really interesting about this type of evidence is that when you wear shoes, there's wear and tear, and the wear and tear is specific to that shoe. It's almost as good as a fingerprint, because this footprint was so clear, it was the best type of shoe print for comparing it to an actual shoe. But you can't match it if you don't have a suspect that has these types of shoes lying around. Their focus goes somewhere else anyway, because a tip comes in, and this seems like it's going to be something massive. A neighbor finally comes forward. She says that the night Rochelle disappeared, she was woken up in the middle of the night because she heard something. She didn't know what it was, so she jumps up and goes to her window. She looks out and sees what she says looks like two people carrying something that looked as though it was a rug, like a wrapped-up, rolled-up rug. We all know that's the sort of thing that remains to be found in when you wrap it up in a tarp or a rug and bring it to a vehicle. But the problem was, this woman was elderly. She was in her 80s and didn't have the best communication skills, and she kept changing her story. They couldn't confirm that this is what she really saw. This wasn't the only tip coming in. Ever since the search happened, there were even more tips. They were pouring in and day out, and they have to investigate each and every one. While they're looking into those tips, someone who attended the bonfire with Andrew comes forward as well, and they say a little bit of something different. Andrew's not involved in this at all. They told police that someone brought that mesquite firewood to the fire pit, and it wasn't Andrew, it was someone else. It was 21-year-old Moises Mendoza. Moises was from the exact same area and knew everybody. He was friends with Andrew and Rochelle. They went to school together, dating back to their childhood in kindergarten. He worked as a repairman in the air conditioning business and was known to hang out with both Andrew and Rochelle. They would always see each other at these bonfire parties and other places around town. Just because someone brought wood to a bonfire where a party is going on doesn't mean that someone else didn't take the wood, bring it somewhere else, and have a devious and horrific intention to harm Rochelle. But they still have to look into each and every clue. They start asking around, was Rochelle involved with Moises? Had they ever dated? What was going on? What was their connection? What was their relationship like? Everyone they talked to said they were just friends. They go way back, but there was no romantic relationship. However, a few people said Moises was heavily intoxicated, just like the story with Andrew. He was also getting a little belligerent, specifically with two girls at the party. And get this, they said that he got so angry at them, he threatened to end their lives. Was this a legitimate tip, or did people have something against Moises? Why would he be throwing around threats like that? People who become intoxicated don't act like themselves, so they don't know. But what they do know is they need to dig deeper. Who were these women, and why would Moises have anything against them? It turns out the same night before the bonfire, there was another party. Moises was there. His friend was throwing a party at his place, and there were some girls who decided to party with them. They went out and got a lot of beer, 2 30-packs of beer and 2 40-ounces cans of beer. Then something transpired that made the girls want to leave. They left without telling anyone, then later called Moises and his friend and said they were not coming back. This is when Moises got really upset. He decided to drink more and more until he was completely out of it. When he went to the bonfire, he drank even more, and that's when he was bothering those 2 other girls. People said it was strange. He kept leaving and coming back, and leaving and coming back, and then finally, he took off once and for all around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning and never returned. So, we have these 2 men who are close to Rochelle, who were at the same party the same night, who had both been drinking until they were completely out of their minds, intoxicated, and they kind of left around the same time. As the police were letting the community know that they needed more information about Moises, that's when Rochelle's best friend comes forward. Her name is Megan Kennedy. She says there was actually another party, but this was the Friday before anything happened to Rochelle. This party was at Rochelle's house. There were about 15 people in attendance, and Moises was one of them. Megan says they were talking, they were carrying on, they looked like they were having a great time, getting along really well. And you know how friends are. They'll pull you aside later and say, "Hey, what's going on? Is something going on between you and Moises?" And Rochelle said she wasn't interested in him like that. They were just friends. She didn't like him that way. Well, the fact that Megan comes forward made her boyfriend come forward, and he has even more information. His name is Tim Holland. On Saturday, before Rochelle disappeared, it turns out that Tim went over to Rochelle's house. This is the day after Rochelle's party, and guess who's with him? He's with Moises and one other friend, Cody. The reason they're there is because Cody was in a band. He was providing the music on the night of Rochelle's party, and he left all of his instruments behind. They went to Rochelle's house, they knocked on the door and nobody answered. They went around, and none of the doors were unlocked. And because they considered Rochelle a really good friend, they didn't think it was that big of a deal if they tried to sort of break in. So Moises, of all people, decided to open the back door somehow. When they asked Moises when he saw Rochelle last, he said it was that Friday at her party, but he did mention that ever since she had disappeared, he was acting strange. He was kind of anxious. He didn't seem like himself. He also added that Moises was definitely into Rochelle. He thought she was really attractive and wanted to date her. According to Moises, though, Rochelle was interested in him. Other friends came forward and said, no, there was definitely not a relationship between him and Rochelle. In their minds, anyway. I mean, there's no way to actually tell because we're not in the relationship, we don't hear the conversations. They gave them more information that leaned in yet another direction, back on Andrew. Apparently, there was an altercation between Andrew and Moises.s. Why would that have occurred if there wasn't something going on between Rochelle and Moises? The most likely scenario would be that there's something going on, and that Andrew's mad about it. They're going through a breakup. He's confronting Moises at a party a few weeks ago. It's even more confusing. It does turn out, and it was confirmed, that Andrew came up to Moises and angrily confronted him at that party, and it was because he was hanging out with Rochelle. They were going to a lot of social events together and parties. They got into it in front of everyone. They didn't get into a physical altercation, but they were throwing words back and forth. Andrew was not happy. He was taking it really seriously, and for the next couple of weeks, people were talking about the fact that at any moment these guys were going to brawl. And the rumors were swirling. There were questions. This is a small town, lots of gossip. These are younger people. Everyone had their own version of what they thought, their own perspective. But more and more of them are suspecting that Moises might have had something to do with Rochelle's death. They're just trying to piece everything together. Some even thought this might have been revenge. Andrew might have done this because he thought Moises and Rochelle were having a relationship, or they were having one. Oh, and the reason why they were thinking this is because, guess what? Andrew had threatened to beat Moises up with a metal baseball bat, and he had even borrowed one from a friend. He was planning to attack him. And as you can probably imagine, and you might be thinking the same thing, this just leaves so many more questions. Because, could it be the other way around? Could Moises have wanted to be with Rochelle, and Andrew was standing in the way? Maybe Rochelle didn't want to get involved because of Andrew, and so he took his anger out on Rochelle that night when he was intoxicated. You know, these love triangles, they cause a lot of drama, and they sometimes lead to these things. There were so many theories going around. The most important thing was that they had to get Moises in for an interview. They had to switch their focus because this was the most important information that they had gotten since the beginning. And yet, there's another bombshell. Someone else comes forward. Her name is Stacy Garcia, and she's a good friend of Moises. She confirms that he liked Rochelle a lot. They'd known each other for a long time, and he always had his eye on her, but they were just friends. They did start getting together recently when he found out that she had finally separated from Andrew. He was just kind of trying to make his move, shoot his shot, so he began asking her out. Stacy says he wasn't getting the answer he wanted, and he wasn't stopping. Every time he got the chance, he would flirt with her and ask her out again and again. Now Stacy wants to help with the investigation, but she's acting really scared. She says that she does have some really important information to tell the police, but there has to be a way that they can promise her she's going to be protected. That's kind of a big deal. She relays to police that she knows what he's capable of, and she's fearful for her life, so their ears perk up. They want to know what's going on. Eventually, when they tell her that everything's going to be fine, nothing's going to happen to her, she won't get hurt, she lets them know that Moises had called her, and this was just the other day. He says he wants to go on a drive, so he picks her up, and they start to drive and talk. That's when she starts giving police some information that only the perpetrator would have known. She's a credible witness. She was definitely onto something and they needed to know more. And they find out that Moises has an extensive criminal record. Not only that, it has to do with crimes carried out against women, also some robberies where he was armed and aggravated. These women that were involved in these crimes were the same age as Rochelle. They were a lot like Rochelle. They fit the profile. Now they're going back and thinking about those girls at the party that were threatened by him, and everything is sort of coming together to make it look like he is their prime suspect. They tried to retrace the path that Moises may have taken the night of the bonfire, and they realized that when he left, he would have had to drive right in front of Rochelle's house. And as a matter of fact, the fact that he had opened up Rochelle's door just a week before made him think he might have done it again on his way home. They had to lock down a way to interview Moises, and then they get another break in the case. Remember those pieces of wood that they sent to the lab, but there really wasn't a way to do anything with them? Well, there was a doctor at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and he had come up with this new technology that could possibly give you results that would link wood together again. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how this works, but they put a laser that goes into the wood and it somehow breaks down the chemical components. The point is, when you sample the surface of the wood, you can figure out what kind of chemicals it's made of. It's really interesting. This was the first time that this forensic test was being used in a criminal case. However, it's scientific in its precise technology. And what they found is the most common chemicals that were usually in samples, they were normal: hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, things that are typically found except for one element, and that was titanium. Titanium did not naturally occur in this kind of wood, so now they're thinking the only way that this wood would have titanium in it is if it was around an industrial area, because titanium pollutes groundwater, and then the tree grows in that area and it accumulates the titanium within its chemical makeup. They test all the wood, the ones from the party and the ones from the crime scene, and they match. They all have the exact same level of titanium. So these sets of wood came from the exact same place. They were a 99.99% match. Not only that, they came from the same population of trees, if not the exact same tree. So what does this mean? Well, it means that there's just more circumstantial evidence that points to Moises and Andrew. Both of them, they weren't quite sure because both men had access to the logs. Well, that really good friend Stacy was about to give them a lot more information about that car ride. Meanwhile, they finally brought Moises in for questioning. They got a warrant for his home and his vehicle. And now, I do have clips of this interview. Remember, At the same time, police are at his house, they're in his car or his truck, and guess what they find? Blood on the tailgate and in the bed of his truck. So of course they take samples and send them back to the lab. Investigators are now going hard with the questioning. They are laying into him, telling him they think he has done this. Of course he's angry and he's getting upset. I think anyone would if they're being accused of a crime, especially one this heinous. They just want to try something that's going to get him to open up. Maybe they can be a little bit more sympathetic, like what happened, we understand. But again, they're still searching his home, and guess what they find? A pair of boots, and they're covered with dirt in what looks like gasoline and soot. This is getting more and more convincing that he's the one that had something to do with this. They bring the shoes back to the lab right away, without even doing a thorough test. Just by looking at the pair of boots, they can tell that the soles of the shoes match what the print looks like. They're the same size, the same design, and guess what? They have some of the same markings. But now they have to check for something else, the accidental characteristics. Some of us walk on the road, some of us walk on the sidewalk, some of us wear them in the car. There's just all these different chances for them to be damaged in a specific way. When you're taking them and putting ink on them, and putting them on a piece of paper and testing it against the print, you're going to see those undeniable characteristics. There's no other way that they're not a match if these characteristics exist in both. And guess what? Well, you could have guessed it. Of course you could have. They were a match. These shoes came from Moises's house. They're a match on the papers. He was there. They're still only finding circumstantial evidence. They have not actually found something that connects him 100%. But they didn't stop there. They found some jeans in the house, and they were bloodstained. So they went ahead and tested those, and guess what? They found it matched Rochelle's DNA. I mean, it's over for Moises right there. There's so much evidence piling up. And what does this mean? There's still some theories that maybe it could have been both Andrew and Moises. At this point, investigators are about to confront him with everything they have because now it's not circumstantial, it's forensic evidence. We have her blood on her pants. They could even smell an accelerant in his house, gasoline or something similar to it, and they just knew he had to have done this. But they needed him to confess, and more importantly, they want to know how, and they want to know why. So they keep pressing him and pressing him and pressing him. Meanwhile, they're getting Stacy to open up. Remember, she was the one that was driving with him, and she said something. She says, "He told me it was him." She said that Moises told her, "I have something to tell you and you're going to be mad at me." And then he says, "Stacy, I did it. It was me." He said he took her by the neck and took the life out of her and then hid her behind his own home. He said that he picked her up from her house. Avery had fallen asleep and that she went on her own volition, leaving her baby asleep alone. Okay, but remember, the room was in disarray. That was not a scene where someone just walked out by themselves and wanted to go hang out with some guy that they were interested in. That's all that Stacy would tell them. And when they tried to contact her for more, she wouldn't answer. And this is getting really intense. She probably knows if he did this to Rochelle, he could do it to her. But after pressing him and pressing him, he confesses. He finally admits that he did it. He tells them that he can tell them anything that they want to know. They knew what happened. They had that information. They were armed with the evidence and everything pointing toward him. He said he woke up the next day and he thought, "Am I in a dream?" And then he realized, "Oh yeah, I did this." He confesses to taking Rochelle's life and then setting her on fire so that he could hide the evidence, so that he could hide his fingerprints. And investigators are right that rope was used to drag her. He literally tells them that he will take them to where it happened, but that he wants a bulletproof vest when he goes to the crime scene. Really? He doesn't want to die? He doesn't want to die, but he's willing to take the life of someone else? But he's concerned that someone's going to harm him? Oh, they arrested him. He's in custody, and when he's going to show them the crime scene and he's handcuffed and shackled and wearing a bulletproof vest, he seems excited. He says he didn't use gasoline, he used lighter fluid. He's telling them everything and just talking fast. It's almost like he's on some kind of high, the high of excitement, the exhilaration that he did this. How could anyone act like that? He said that he buried the lighter fluid and the matches because he had taken them from his home. He says that after he went to the party, he drove home, and as he was passing her house, he sees that she has a light on. Because, She had gotten home and she had a sinus headache, and she was doing laundry, eating a snack, baby was probably going to bed. He did use that back door like he had done before. He says he let himself in, but when he got there, she was fine with him being there. She's just in the kitchen in shorts and a little t-shirt. He says that they just went to go grab some cigarettes. She was just in the kitchen, and she wanted cigarettes. But the police don't think that adds up, because when they went to her home, they found a pack of cigarettes at her house. It wasn't as though she didn't already have cigarettes. They know she never came back. So did she really need to go out for more? They know the house was a mess, and that this was not voluntary. He says they started driving, and for whatever reason, something happened. He doesn't know why, but he grabbed her by the throat, and the next thing he knew she was unconscious. He doesn't explain why he does this. He says he doesn't even know. And his other excuse was, he was drunk. But not all people that get drunk carry out this kind of crime. It just horrifies me to know that he's able to tell this story, just nonchalantly tell this story that he's describing the last moments of somebody's life, like he's talking about eating breakfast. He tells police, "Oh, my hands are sore." He's like rubbing his thumb and his hands. They're so sore from all the work that he had to do. Really? Who cares? But this really got to me because she's not even deceased. She's alive, she's unconscious, but she is alive. And what does he do? He goes to the back of his house, and there's a big field there. She comes to, and apparently he doesn't want her to know that it's him, so he covers her face with a ski mask, and he does it again and again. He takes his hands on her neck, the same thing over and over, and it's just really disgusting to me. She's begging for her life, she's trying to escape. She was asking him why. You can hear him say it. She tried to get away. Tell me about that. She couldn't. Why are you doing this? And I told her, I don't know. And at this point, he was forcing himself on her. We know that there was injury, just taking advantage of the situation. It's terrible. He finally got what he wanted this whole time. He's just been fantasizing about wanting to be with her. Well, he takes what he wants, and it's sickening. It's not something that my brain can comprehend. And for good measure, he takes out his pocket knife, and he uses it to penetrate her throat. But instead of telling police what really happened, because we know what happened, he describes it as poking her neck. Really? No, this was a wound that chipped a vertebrae in her spine. He says that after he's done all this, he didn't know what to do. So he decides to go back to his house where there's a lot of trees and weeds and brush and tears them out so that he can put them on top of her. He goes back, he gets his truck, he moves her body. But that's not where she was found, because a few days later, investigators actually went by his home. He wasn't even a suspect. He was acting really nervous, and that's when he became scared that they were going to find her. So he decides to go to the fire pit. I have never heard anything like this before. He didn't want to touch her. Now you don't want to touch her, but this is the woman that all you could think about was touching her and getting to her. After everything that he told investigators, he's the audacity to plead not guilty because he didn't want to die. You can take someone's innocent life, a mother, a young girl, but he's so cowardly that he wants to avoid death himself. This man has no remorse. He is completely blank and sickening and cold-hearted. What we know is that he was in that house. His shoe print was on those divorce papers. There was a struggle. She didn't go with him on her own. When you plead not guilty, prosecutors now are forced to prove that it happened, to gather all of the evidence, all of the forensics, and remember, the forensic evidence about the logs had never been used in a criminal case. But they did have the DNA in the clothing that linked to him, but they still had to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. His trial was set shortly after all of this happens. He was held in Collin County Jail on a $500,000 bond. When everyone found out it was Moises, they were in shock. It was so brutal, and friends and family that knew Rochelle and knew Moises couldn't believe that someone you had known all that time could just turn around and do something like this. When a neighbor that lived next to Moises found out what he did, she said that she had such kind things to say about his family, but not about him. He wasn't a good boy and he never was. It turns out he'd attacked his own sister in the yard of their home, and of course, the sister, she didn't go through with the trial because of that. It was never put on his record. He had already been facing 3 first-degree felony indictments for a connection to a series of robberies, and at the time that this was happening, apparently he had a tracking device on his ankle. I don't know how these people seem to slip through the system. I just don't get it. A guy named Roy Levins that remembered Moises from him cutting his grass around the neighborhood said that he was polite and hardworking and his dad worked in a church. They just had such a hard time piecing this together and realizing that this actually happened. Andrew was completely beside himself. He acted the way he did because he just lost the love of his life. He said he would always continue to love her and that he would always be there for Avery in any way that he possibly could. And then, he truly loves her with all of his heart and he'll always remember her and make sure that Avery would never forget her mother. Even though she was never going to be around anymore, Andrew's mother and Michelle's family really wanted Avery to have a beautiful life. They never wanted her to forget her mom. They said they would give her the baby book and that they would always show her pictures and videos so she would never forget her mother. There were some letters that were found, some letters that were written to his parents, and I want to tell you about them. But first, I want to give you some happy news before I go into that. Avery is being raised by Rochelle's parents, and they're so grateful to everyone that helped with the search. They're grateful to the forensic technicians, the investigators, and their community. They're also so grateful that this man is going to be put to death for his horrendous crime. While I was looking through all of the websites, I found an anonymous post on a website called truecrimefanclub.com. Anonymous says on October 18th, 2021, so this wasn't that long ago. I'm actually a very close friend of Avery's. Her family is and always will keep their promise of keeping Rochelle's memory alive for Avery. I never had any interest in learning more about her mom's death until now. Avery is the spitting image of her mother, a wonderful and thoughtful girl with dreams similar to her mom's. I wish I could have known Rochelle. She was a great mother. Her old letters give Avery advice as well. Pam is like a second mother to me. I can't even imagine how hard it is. Their family is amazing, and I wouldn't ask anyone for a better friend than Avery. But I feel like other people should know that their family and Rochelle's family are still thriving and amazing people. Now this is the part one hope you stayed for, because this is something else I found and it's very interesting. 2 days after he was arrested, he wrote that letter to his parents, and it said, "I don't know what happened to me. At that moment, I turned into the devil." And there was a lot of confessions in the letter, and I guess you can see why it is so easy, even if there wasn't enough evidence in this case for the jury to convict him. In that same letter, he says that he's trying to repent, and he takes all responsibility, but adds, "I don't know that when you find this, I will be alive or dead." He was put on July 24th watch when he was booked into jail because, they were afraid that he might do something to himself. His mom admits that she noticed Moises was getting more and more angry the last couple of years. She says, "I believe that Moises has psychological problems with his anger. Last year his anger increased. Moises would become angry at himself and told me that he wanted to die." Well, then you could have made a different choice, couldn't you? Instead, you took someone else's life. You're still alive. Oh, and he was begging for pen pals. That's right, there's a website. He says, "My name is Moises Mendoza. I arrived on death row July 1st, 2005. I would like to become friends with anyone who's willing to write me. I'm easygoing and I consider myself a good friend. I would like to meet someone who needs a friend because I need one also. I would like to meet someone who's willing to help me fight for my life, emotionally, spiritually, and in any other way possible. Although I'm on death row, my struggle to fight for my life will be long and hard." Did you think about the fact that Rochelle had to fight for her life? I just can't believe people can think this way. He goes on to say that he is going to fight with another appeal, and he hopes he can keep fighting for his life daily, because if he doesn't, who will? I want to meet someone who can help in any way they can. I realize I'm not in a good position to give out advice, but I always have hope that my words will help someone from making some of the same mistakes that I've made in life. My hobbies include exercising, writing, reading poetry, drawing, and studying the law. I like all music. I'm looking for a pen pal 18 or older. If anything about me interests you, don't hesitate. Please drop me a few lines so that we can get to know each other. God bless. And then he gives the address, which I am not going to tell you. I don't think you want to write this man. As far as I can tell, he's still on death row. I couldn't find any other information. I don't have an execution date. It's completely devastating. And what I want to leave you with is, we don't know how long we have. And I know that sounds morbid, and I know it sounds depressing, but we don't know what day will be our last.